The fluorescent lights in Bay 7 of the Ridgeline Distribution Center had been flickering since October, and no one had fixed them because fixing things cost money, and money was the one commodity this company managed with the same ruthlessness it applied to everything else. Maya Calloway had learned to work in the stuttering half-light the way animals learn to navigate caves, through patience and memory, and the stubborn refusal to admit that the conditions were unacceptable. Her scanner beeped against industrial shelving at 2:14 in the morning, reading barcodes on frozen beef patties that would reach grocery stores before anyone in this building went home. 12 hours into a 14-hour shift. 6 days a week for the past 3 months because the holidays had bumped orders and the company needed warm bodies willing to trade their sleep for a paycheck that barely cleared enough to matter. She was 34 years old, and her lower back had started making sounds her grandmother used to make. The scanner beeped again. She moved down the aisle, boots squeaking on concrete still damp from the afternoon's delivery. Her breath came out in small clouds. The cold storage section ran 10 degrees below the rest of the warehouse, and even through 3 layers and the company-issued vest that smelled like everyone who had worn it before her, the chill found ways in. Wrists. The back of her neck. The particular cold that lived in joints when they hadn't quite recovered from the last shift before the next one started. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She ignored it. Her supervisor Carl had made it abundantly clear that personal calls during inventory were grounds for the kind of conversation that ended with someone carrying their belongings in a box, and Maya did not have the luxury of losing this job. Not with rent due in 9 days. Not with Cole's school needing a field trip deposit by Friday. Not with the back passenger brake on her 2009 Civic making a sound that her mechanically inclined neighbor Frank had described, with genuine sympathy and no exaggeration, as expensive. The phone buzzed again. She kept scanning. Then it buzzed a third time, and a fourth, the insistent pattern of someone who had decided that reaching her was non-negotiable regardless of the hour, and she ducked around the corner of the aisle, out of Carl's sight line, and pulled the phone from her pocket. Unknown number. Ohio area code. Not Columbus, not Cleveland. Something smaller, farther out. She answered with the wary tone of someone expecting bad news to arrive formatted as a stranger. Maya Calloway. The voice was older. Male. Deliberate in its pacing. The way people spoke when they had learned that patience was a professional virtue and rushing was the habit of people who hadn't thought things through. This is she. She pressed herself against the shelving unit, keeping her voice low. My name is Walter Griggs. I'm an attorney in Harlan, Ohio. I've been trying to reach you for several days. I apologize for the hour, but I understand you work nights, and I felt this matter deserved a real conversation rather than a voicemail. Harlan. The name landed somewhere in her chest before her brain fully processed it. Harlan was 3 hours southeast of Cleveland, a town of maybe 4,000 people tucked into farmland that had been slowly losing its argument with the 21st century. She hadn't been to Harlan in 2 years. She hadn't been to Harlan since the funeral. Since the November morning, she'd driven 3 hours each way to stand at a graveside in a field that smelled of turned earth and coming cold, holding Cole's hand while her Uncle Dennis stood on the other side of the hole with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and his eyes already calculating what would need to be liquidated. This is about my grandfather. She said it flatly. Not a question. Earl Calloway passed away 14 months ago. Walter Griggs's voice softened by a measured degree, the way a person's voice softened when they had delivered difficult news so many times they had found the precise calibration between warmth and professionalism. I handled his affairs for nearly 40 years. I've been reaching out to his family since the estate proceedings concluded. I've spoken with most of the others already. The others. She could imagine exactly which others had taken Walter Griggs's calls promptly and without prompting. Her Uncle Dennis, who had driven down from Columbus within a week of the funeral to stand in Grandpa Earl's kitchen and assess what could be liquidated. Her Aunt Patricia, who had asked about the value of Earl's coin collection before the burial was even scheduled. Her mother Diane, who had wept at the graveside with genuine grief and then spent the drive home discussing whether the butcher shop could be sold before winter set in and made the property harder to show. I've been difficult to reach, Maya said. It wasn't quite an apology. You have, but I understand you have a busy life. Griggs paused. Miss Calloway, your grandfather left instructions regarding his estate. Specific, detailed instructions that he put considerable thought into over many years. I'm calling because those instructions pertain to you directly. She kept her voice steady through an effort of will. What kind of instructions? The primary asset of Earl Calloway's estate is the commercial property at 4 Industrial Loop Road in Harlan. The building, the equipment, and all contents therein. Another pause, weighted with something she couldn't yet name. He left it to you, Miss Calloway. Everything on that property, solely and completely to you. The shelving unit was cold against her back. Somewhere 2 aisles over, a forklift beeped its warning signal as it reversed through the dark. The fluorescent lights kept their stuttering rhythm overhead, indifferent to whatever was happening inside Maya Calloway's chest. He left me the butcher shop, she said slowly. The butcher shop, the cold storage facility, the equipment, and all property contained within the building and on the lot. Griggs's voice carried something she couldn't quite identify. Carefully maintain neutrality, she decided, after a moment. The voice of a man who knew more than he was saying and had decided that some things were better delivered in person, in a room where you could watch someone's face and make adjustments accordingly. My Uncle Dennis is going to lose his mind. A brief silence that might have contained a carefully suppressed sound. The other members of your grandfather's family have already been notified of the distribution. I should tell you that some of them have expressed strong feelings about the arrangement. I'll bet they have. Maya looked down at the scanner in her hand, at the inventory sheet on her clipboard, at the 12 remaining aisles of frozen product that still needed to be logged before her shift ended. She thought about Cole, sleeping in their apartment 3 miles from here, watched over by their downstairs neighbor Mrs. Antonescu, who charged $30 for overnight sitting and never asked for it before payday because she understood how payday worked. She thought about the break, the field trip deposit, the 9 days. What's the property worth? The commercial property itself has a tax-assessed value of approximately $80,000. Griggs said, the building is older. It requires some maintenance. The business has been closed for 14 months. In the current market, you might receive 90 to perhaps 100,000 at a willing buyer's sale. The equipment would need to be sold separately, and most of it is specialized enough that finding the right buyers could take time. $90,000. She turned the number over in her mind, feeling its weight and shape. 90,000 sounded like something until you subtracted the taxes, the estate fees, the cost of whatever maintenance the building required after 14 months standing empty, the time it would take to find a buyer who wanted commercial property in a town of 4,000. After all of that, she might clear 15 or 20,000 in her pocket, which meant 6 months of breathing room, maybe 8 if she was very careful, and then she would be right back here, standing in a cold warehouse at 2 in the morning, counting frozen beef patties under flickering light. It wasn't nothing, but it wasn't transformation. It was the difference between drowning and treading water still left you in the same river. Miss Calloway. Walter Griggs's voice shifted slightly, something more deliberate in its pacing now, a word being chosen with particular care. Your grandfather was quite specific that you come to Harlan to receive the property personally. He left instructions, not just legal documents. He left a letter, and there are aspects of the property that I believe he felt should be explained in person rather than over the phone or through paperwork. She was quiet for a moment, listening to the particular texture of what he wasn't saying. What kind of aspects? I'd rather not speculate. The careful voice of a man who had learned, probably expensively, the consequences of speculation. But Earl was very clear. He wanted you to come yourself. He wanted you to walk through that building with your own eyes before anyone made any decisions about its future. She thought about the last time she had seen her grandfather. A Sunday afternoon in April, 2 years before he died, when she had driven Cole down to Harlan on impulse, because Cole had never met his great-grandfather, and she had felt the particular urgency that people felt when they sensed time compressing in ways they couldn't calculate. Earl had been 85, slower than she remembered from her childhood, but alert in his eyes in a way that made you understand the body was just infrastructure and the person inside it was unchanged. He had taken Cole to see the cold storage, holding the boy's small hand as they walked through the insulated door into the chill, explaining in his quiet and unhurried voice how the temperatures worked, how old commercial refrigeration functioned differently than the units they built now, why a butcher needed separate areas for different products, and what happened to the quality of meat if you got those temperatures wrong by even a few degrees. Cole had been 5 years old and utterly fascinated. Earl had been 85 and patient in the way that people were patient when they had decided that patience was the whole point of a conversation, not just a means to get to something else. He had hugged Maya goodbye in the parking lot when they left, and he had held on an extra moment. "You're the one who comes," he had said. Quiet, matter of fact, like he was noting something he had observed over a long time and was finally saying aloud. "When something matters, you're the one who shows up." She hadn't known what to say to that, so she had just held on. "I'll come Saturday," she told Walter Griggs. "I can be there by noon." She heard the exhale in the old lawyer's voice, carefully restrained but present. "I'll have everything ready. Drive carefully, Miss Calloway. Those roads can be tricky this time of year." She hung up and stood in the cold aisle for a long moment, the scanner hanging loose in her hand, the inventory sheet forgotten. Then she picked up the scanner and returned to counting, because the shift still had 2 hours in it, and Carl was still watching, and the beef patties still needed to be logged, and the earth kept turning regardless of what was trying to reorganize itself in her chest. She finished her shift. She drove home through streets still dark and emptied by the hour, the brake making its expensive sound at every intersection, the heater doing its imperfect best against the November air. She paid Mrs. Antonescu, who asked no questions because she never asked questions. She stood in the doorway of Cole's room and watched him sleep for a few minutes the way that parents did when they needed to remember the actual living reason underneath all the numbers, the arithmetic, the invoices and overdue notices, and the careful management of $411 until the next paycheck. Then she went to her own bed and lay awake until the city outside began to gray at its edges, running calculations she couldn't resolve, turning over the sound of Walter Griggs's voice and the things that had been behind it, the spaces where explanation had been withheld. In the morning, Cole ate cereal at the kitchen table while she packed a bag, watching her with the particular attention of a 7-year-old who understood that something was different without being able to name it precisely. He was a serious child, small for his age, with dark eyes that registered more than he let on. He had gotten that quality from somewhere that wasn't his father. His father, Marcus, had been a talker, a man who filled every silence with noise the way some people filled every wall with pictures. And Cole had come out of that marriage a listener, as if he had learned early that words were more valuable if you didn't spend them carelessly. "Where are we going?" he asked. "Harlan, to see Great-Grandpa Earl's old shop." Cole processed this with the thoughtful gravity he brought to new information. "Is it because of the inheritance?" She looked at him over the bag she was zipping. "Where did you hear about that?" "Grandma Diane called last night while you were at work. She was talking to Mrs. Antonescu in the hallway. She said Grandpa Earl left you the butcher shop and Uncle Dennis was really upset." He spooned cereal, considering. She didn't sound happy either. Of course she hadn't. Maya's mother Diane occupied a complicated position in the architecture of Calloway family grievances. She had loved her father genuinely, in the particular way that people loved parents they had also spent their lives slightly embarrassed by, and she had made her peace with Earl. Being a butcher in the same way some people made peace with a chronic condition, by managing it carefully and not drawing unnecessary attention to it. Diane had married up, or at least sideways in a way, into the kind of solid middle-class respectability that didn't require explanation at dinner parties. She'd spent 40 years steering conversations away from her father's occupation with the practiced smoothness of someone who had done it so many times it had become automatic, referring to him as a small business owner when pressed and hoping no one asked for specifics. The fact that Earl had looked past his own children and the grandchildren who had built conventional and comfortable lives to leave his property to Maya, who worked warehouse night shifts and lived in a 2-bedroom apartment and drove a car with a broken brake, would have landed in Diane's chest like a verdict she hadn't been present to contest. "Mom." Cole watched her face carefully. "Is the butcher shop important?" She thought about Walter Griggs's pauses, the things that had been behind his words and below them and deliberately removed from them. "I think it might be," she said. "I honestly don't know yet. Can I come?" She had already decided he was coming. She had nowhere else for him to go on a Saturday, and beyond the logistics, she had the feeling, inexplicable and persistent, that Earl would have wanted Cole there. He had held the boy's hand walking into that cold storage and explained refrigeration temperatures to a 5-year-old with complete seriousness and evident pleasure, because he had believed that children deserved to be explained things properly. "Get your shoes," she said, "and pack your book." The drive to Harlan took 3 hours and 15 minutes, accounting for 2 stops, one for gas and one for Cole to stand at a rest area fence watching a brown winter field for reasons he didn't explain and she didn't ask about. The Ohio landscape rolled past, flat and patient, under a November sky the color of unpolished pewter. She drove through the particular grammar of small towns along the way, the dollar stores and closed diners and grain elevators standing against the horizon like monuments to a way of life that kept losing the argument with time but hadn't stopped making it. Harlan appeared the way small towns appeared when you had been away long enough to see them fresh rather than through the blur of familiarity, smaller than memory insisted, more worn at the edges, but carrying underneath the wear a quality of accumulated time that larger places tended to lose. Generations of decisions layered one on top of another until the whole town was a kind of record of who people had chosen to be and what they had chosen to keep. Walter Griggs's office occupied the second floor of a building on Main Street that might have been a hardware store in another life. The stairs creaked in a way that announced everyone who climbed them. The waiting room held chairs upholstered in a plaid pattern that belonged to a more optimistic decade, and the woman at the front desk looked up at Maya with the recognition of someone who had been given a description in advance and was confirming it matched. Walter Griggs emerged from his inner office before Maya had fully given her name. He was in his early 70s, lean and slightly stooped. With wire-rimmed glasses he touched periodically as though confirming they were still where he had left them, and the handshake of someone who had learned that a handshake could communicate reliability without needing to demonstrate strength. He shook Cole's hand next, formally and with full attention, the way people did when they understood that treating children seriously was not a performance but a position. "Miss Calloway, thank you for making the drive." He looked at Cole. "And this must be Cole. Your great-grandfather mentioned you." Cole's eyes went wide, briefly, before he collected himself. "He knew about me?" "He did." Walter's expression carried something warm but complicated, the expression of a man holding more than he was yet releasing. "Come in. Please sit." The inner office was dense in the way of offices that had accumulated their contents over decades of actual work rather than decorating themselves to suggest depth they didn't have. Filing cabinets along every wall. Bookshelves stacked 2 layers deep. Framed photographs of Harlan from across the years, the town in different configurations of itself, losing things and gaining things, and losing more than it gained. A man who had done the same work in the same place for 40 years generated this kind of density. Evidence of continuity. Walter folded his hands on the desk. "I'll give you the legal summary first," he said, "and then I have something from Earl directly." He pulled a manila folder from the organized stack at his right. "The property at 4 Industrial Loop Road is completely free of any liens or mortgages. Earl paid it off in 1989 and never borrowed against it afterward. The building is 4,200 square feet on a half-acre lot. The business license has lapsed since his death, but the property itself transfers cleanly to you as sole inheritor. No other claims on it." She was thinking of Dennis. Walter's expression remained professionally even. Earl's will was written in 2015 and amended twice, most recently in 2021. The language is precise and unambiguous. His children, including your mother and your Uncle Dennis and your Aunt Patricia, received other assets from his estate. Personal property, a small savings account, his vehicles. The property at Industrial Loop Road was specifically designated for you. He paused, and something shifted slightly in his face. Earl anticipated that this would be contested. He took considerable care to make the legal language resistant to challenge. Contested meaning Dennis. Dennis and his attorney filed a challenge in probate court 7 months ago. The court dismissed it last month. The property is yours, legally and without encumbrance. That's why I waited to contact you until the legal position was entirely settled. I wanted you to receive this without conditions still pending. Cole had pulled his book from his backpack, but was not reading it. He was watching Walter Griggs with those dark, attentive eyes, storing information the way he always stored information, quietly and without telegraphing what he was doing. "Why me?" Maya asked. She had been carrying the question for 3 hours of highway. "I'm not even blood grandchild. My mother is. Dennis is his actual son. Why did he leave this to me?" Walter Griggs reached for a sealed envelope that sat apart from the other documents on his desk, separated from them with a deliberateness that said it had been placed there specifically. Thick cream-colored paper, sealed with tape that Earl had signed across, so any opening would be visible. Her name on the front in Earl's handwriting, the handwriting of a man whose formal education had ended at 16, but who had never stopped practicing the discipline of clear legibility. This is his answer to that question, Walter said. He asked that you read it at the property. He was very specific about that. He held the envelope out. But I can tell you what he said to me when he made the final amendment to the will, because he explained his reasoning directly. Walter looked at her steadily over the tops of his glasses. He said that when he needed family, you were the one who came. He said you were the only one who brought your child to meet him. He said you arrived without wanting anything, without an agenda. Walter paused long enough to let that settle. He also said that you were the only one who ever asked him what the cold storage smelled like. Something moved through Maya's chest. She remembered that question. She had been maybe 10 years old, visiting in summer, standing in the doorway of the cold storage and asking Earl why it smelled the way it did, like cold metal and something older underneath, when other cold places just smelled like plain refrigerated air. He had spent 20 minutes explaining commercial refrigeration to a 10-year-old with complete seriousness, standing there in his apron with flour on his forearms from the morning's work, telling her about moisture and metal and what happened to air when it was held at a constant temperature inside insulated walls for decades. She had listened and asked follow-up questions and completely forgotten the conversation somewhere in the way that childhood memories compressed and rearranged themselves. Apparently, Earl had not forgotten it. There's one more thing, Walter said. He reached into his desk drawer and produced a small index card, the kind Earl had used his whole working life for inventory and notes, and the small necessary record-keeping of a commercial business. One side covered in Earl's careful handwriting. He slid it across the desk. He left this with instructions that it should go directly to you when you arrived. He said you would understand what to do with it. Maya picked up the card and read it. The smell you remember. Start there. The coldest place. Not the first door and not the second. The one at the back where I kept the good cuts for the people who knew to ask. Look at the wall like you're reading it. Everything I couldn't say out loud is written there. She turned the card over. The reverse was blank. Cole had leaned sideways to read the card without being invited to, the way he did with things that interested him. He looked up at her with an expression that mixed genuine excitement with the solemnity he reserved for things that felt as though they mattered beyond their surface. It's a clue, he said quietly. It does seem like it. A real one. She folded the card and put it carefully in her coat pocket. Let's go see the shop. Dennis was in the parking lot outside Walter's office. She had expected this in the abstract, had known somewhere in the logic of knowing her family that Dennis would not simply receive his dismissal from the will and drive back to Columbus to process it in private. Dennis Calloway was 61 years old and had spent his adult life operating from the assumption that being Earl's son meant something specific about inheritance and priority and the natural order of things, an assumption so foundational that having it contradicted by a probate court would not have retired it, only redirected it. He had brought his wife Karen, who stood a half step behind him with the expression of someone who had not been given a vote in the decision to come. He had also brought Brandon Merritt, which was the part that made Maya's stomach tighten in a way that had nothing to do with nerves and everything to do with recognizing a play. She knew Merritt by reputation because Harlan was small enough that reputations moved through it faster than people did. Brandon Merritt was 40-something and wore the kind of confidence that came from having money that didn't argue with his decisions. He was the kind of developer who looked at a town like Harlan and saw not what it was, but what it could be converted into, the particular commercial vision that transformed small towns into versions of each other, strip malls and franchise anchors and parking lots where something specific and irreplaceable had been. He had bought 3 properties on the south end of Harlan in the past 2 years. Everyone in town knew he had been trying to acquire the Industrial Loop Road property since before Earl died. Maya, Dennis's voice carried the controlled temperature of managed anger, the particular register of someone keeping heat below boiling because witnesses were present. He was broader than their grandfather had been, a bigger physical presence, and he sometimes used it the way he was using it now, standing positioned to take up more of the space between them than was strictly necessary. I figured I'd save everyone time and meet you here. Uncle Dennis. She kept her voice at the register she had learned over 4 years of night shifts, the register that said she had been tired before this conversation started, and she would be tired after it ended, and the conversation itself was not going to change that fundamental condition. Cole's hand found hers automatically, the way it did when his body registered tension his brain was still processing. Dennis's eyes moved briefly to Cole. The calculation of how a child's presence adjusted his available options was brief and visible. I want you to understand something before you make decisions about that property. The building needs a new roof. The refrigeration systems are outdated and would cost $40,000 to replace properly. The plumbing hasn't been inspected in over a decade. You are inheriting a liability, not an asset. Anyone who tells you different hasn't looked at it honestly. That's a very specific assessment for someone who hasn't been inside the building since the funeral. Dennis's jaw tightened. I've had people look at it. He half-turned toward Brandon Merritt, who took the gesture as his cue and stepped forward with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to being introduced to solve problems. Maya Calloway. Merritt's smile was constructed rather than felt, the architectural product of someone who had learned what a reassuring smile looked like and reproduced it from memory. He extended his hand. Maya looked at it and did not take it. I've been meaning to introduce myself directly. I think there's an opportunity here that works for everyone involved. That property has been sitting empty for over a year. It's not generating value for anyone. It's depreciating by standing idle. He said it with the measured concern of someone performing concern for an audience. I'm prepared to offer you $120,000 for the property, as is, no inspection contingencies, cash close within 30 days. You walk away clean. No headaches, no carrying costs, no uncertainty about what the building's condition will cost you. No, Maya said. The same way she said no to Cole when the answer was settled and not a negotiation. Merritt's smile adjusted without disappearing. I understand this is a lot to absorb at once. You don't have to decide today, but I'd encourage you to have an independent inspection done before you let attachment to the property. I haven't even been inside it yet. She looked from Merritt back to Dennis, because Merritt was the instrument and Dennis had brought him and the distinction mattered. I'm going now. You're not coming. Dennis's face moved through several things. That property should have gone to me. Earl wasn't making clear decisions in his last years, and if you think I'm going to stand back and watch you, the probate court has already ruled on your challenge. She met his eyes steadily, and she kept her voice level with the ease of someone who had practiced steadiness because the alternative was more expensive than she could afford. I'm sorry this didn't go the way you expected. I know you believed you would inherit from your father. I know that must be genuinely painful. But this is what Earl decided, and I intend to honor it. Honor it. He said it the way people said words they wanted to corrode with contempt. By doing what exactly? You're going to move to Harlan and run a butcher shop? You can barely keep yourself above water in Cleveland. The words landed. She felt them land with the particular precision of someone who had aimed them, who knew their edge because they contained enough truth to function as a weapon. She was barely keeping herself above water in Cleveland. The break. The deposit. The 9 days until rent. None of it was hidden from anyone who cared to look. Cole's hand tightened around hers. She held Dennis's gaze for a moment without filling the silence. Then she picked up her bag and walked to her car. That offer has a shelf life, Merritt said to her back. She did not turn around. The property at 4 Industrial Loop Road sat 6 blocks from Main Street and several years away from it in a different sense, down a stub of road behind the town's commercial strip that served 4 or 5 buildings erected in an era when Harlan's economy had included actual industrial activity. 3 of the neighboring buildings were empty now, their windows dark and their parking lots slowly being reclaimed at the edges by opportunistic weeds. A storage facility occupied the corner with its joyless orange doors. And then there was Calloway's Meats. It was larger than she remembered, or perhaps she was seeing it differently now that it was hers, and the question of what it meant had changed shape. A single-story building in concrete block, painted a faded green that might once have been a more assertive color. The glass-fronted retail area at one corner, its windows covered from the inside with butcher paper that had yellowed and curled at the edges. The parking lot with its faded painted lines. The loading dock on the south side where delivery trucks had backed in across 5 decades of operation. And above the entrance, still mounted and still legible, the business sign in black letters on white. Calloway's Meats, EST 1971. Cole tipped his head back to read the sign. Is this where great-grandpa worked his whole life? He built it himself, Maya said. Bought the land and had the building constructed when he was 31 years old. How did he afford it? She thought about it honestly. I don't know exactly. He never talked much about money. He just worked. She found the key Walter had given her, heavy and commercial on its plain ring, and walked to the entrance. The lock was stiff from 14 months of disuse but turned with patience, and the door swung inward. The smell reached her before anything visual registered. Cold, but not the active cold of running machinery. The settled cold of a building that had been shut and still for a long time. The cold that accumulated in walls and in floors and held itself there long after the equipment maintaining it had been turned off. Beneath the cold, something older and more specific. Metal and wood and decades of the same work done in the same space. The particular scent of a building that had done real work for a long time and remembered it. It was not unpleasant. It was specific in the way that someone's kitchen was specific, in the way that spaces where people had lived and worked held something of them in the air and the surfaces long after they were gone. She stood in the doorway for a moment, letting herself adjust to it. Cole stepped in beside her and made a small quiet sound, not quite a word. She found the light switches inside the door and flipped them. Two of the overhead fixtures responded, casting a watery fluorescent light over the old retail space. The display cases stood empty, their glass still clear, wiped clean. The equipment behind the counter was covered with clean cloths. The floor had been swept. Earl had closed this place down carefully, she could see. He had turned off the lights and walked out and left everything in order, the way a person left a space when they intended it to be found by someone who would care about what they found. The retail area opened into the workroom. Stainless steel surfaces, commercial equipment that had been properly covered and properly maintained. A bandsaw, a meat grinder of a size she remembered from childhood visits. A vacuum seal unit she didn't remember, probably added later. The machinery had been used and cared for in equal proportion, the particular equilibrium of a working professional who understood that tools only served you as well as you served them. She recognized the layout from the visits of her childhood, the specific geography of a place known early enough to be carried in the body rather than just in memory. Standing in the workroom, she knew where the next room was before she looked for it. She knew the angle of the corridor, the placement of the doors, the way the cold intensified as you moved toward the back of the building. 3 doors in the cold storage corridor. Heavy insulated commercial doors with stainless steel hardware, built to hold temperature against the ambient warmth of a working building. She passed the first, the walk-in cooler. She passed the second, the main commercial freezer, larger, colder, where bulk product had been stored for the week's sales. And then the corridor turned, and at the end of the turn was the 3rd door. She stopped. She pulled out Earl's index card and read it again, though she had already memorized it on the drive down. Not the first door and not the second. The one at the back where I kept the good cuts for the people who knew to ask. The 3rd door was different from the others. She noticed it as soon as she saw it, with the eye of someone who had spent 4 years reading warehouse inventory, cataloging what belonged where and what was out of place. The hardware matched. The handle was the same stainless steel design, but the door itself was older. The surface texture was different. Subtly, the way things that had been made in different decades were different even when they were functionally identical. This door had been here since the beginning. The other 2 might be replacements, updated equipment in a building that had been maintained over time, but this door was original. It had been here since Earl built the place in 1971. The key ring held 5 keys. She had already used the main commercial key at the front door. She tried the others in sequence. The 4th key she tried, a small brass key, old-fashioned in a way that matched the door's vintage, fit the lock and turned with a cleanness that said it had been used recently. The lock had been maintained. The mechanism was oiled. Someone had been here, or had arranged for someone to be here, and had made sure this door would open when the right person arrived with the right key. The door swung outward. The cold that rushed out was of a different order than the cold in the rest of the storage corridor. Sharper, denser. The cold of a space that was being actively maintained at a lower temperature than the surrounding areas. The cold of a dedicated freezer still running at full operation. This unit was on. After 14 months of the business being closed, this specific freezer was still drawing power, still maintaining its temperature, still preserving whatever was inside it. Maya stepped in. The space was smaller than the main freezer. 12 feet by 16 feet, approximately. Industrial shelving along 3 walls. The same commercial steel units she had seen elsewhere in the building, all of them empty. The concrete floor had been painted once, and the paint had worn back to bare concrete in the paths where feet and equipment had moved most. The overhead light was a single unit, sufficient, casting clean white light over everything. The shelves were empty. Whatever product had once been stored here had been removed or used before Earl closed the business. Nothing remained on any of the shelving. She stood in the cold and let her eyes move slowly around the room, moving the way her grandfather had told her to do on a card she had read 4 times in a car and read again now by memory. Look at the wall like you're reading it. The shelving units lined 3 walls. The 4th wall, the back wall of the building, was concrete block, the same material as the rest of the structure. She moved her eyes across it slowly, left to right, bottom to top, the way she moved her eyes across inventory sheets, looking for what was there and what wasn't, looking for what fit and what didn't. In the center of the back wall, a section approximately 3 feet wide and running full height, the mortar between the blocks was different. Not dramatically different. Not the kind of difference you would see in a casual glance. But she was not giving it a casual glance. She was reading it, the way Earl had told her to, and when you read something carefully you saw what a quick scan missed. The mortar in that central section was smoother than the surrounding mortar. The surrounding mortar had the rough and pitted texture of old work, 50-year-old work, work that had been exposed to temperature cycles and humidity variations in time. The mortar in the center section had fewer pits, finer texture, the texture of work done more recently by someone who had been careful about it. She crossed the room and put her hand flat against the central section. Then she formed a fist and knocked. The blocks gave back a hollow resonance. Not the solid dead thud of concrete backed by earth or foundation. A hollow sound that said there was space behind it. A space of some meaningful size, because the resonance had depth to it. She turned to look at Cole. He was standing in the doorway of the freezer, his breath making small clouds in the cold air, his book forgotten in his hand, his dark eyes very wide and very steady. "Mom," he said, quietly, in the voice he used when he was being very serious. "There's a room behind the wall." She turned back to the wall. She pulled out her phone and used it as a directed light, moving the beam slowly across the surface of that central section, looking for what Earl had put there for her to find. Looking for what he had said he had written there, what he couldn't say out loud but had needed to leave behind. She found it near the top of the central section, close to the ceiling, in the right corner where the new mortar met the old. Small letters incised into the surface of the mortar with something sharp and thin, not scratched carelessly, but carved with the deliberate precision of someone who wanted them to remain legible and remain findable only by someone looking for them. She had to rise up on the balls of her feet and hold the light at an angle to read them clearly. 12 digits. 4 and 4 and 4, spaced the way a combination was spaced, the way you would write a combination to make it readable in sequence. She stood there in the cold with the numbers filling her field of vision and the hollow space behind the wall behind them and the sound of the active freezer running around her. And she understood that the property Walter Griggs had told her was worth $90,000 to $100,000 was worth something that had not yet been calculated by anyone who had been inside this room. She photographed the numbers carefully from 2 angles, then put her phone back in her pocket. She stood for another moment looking at the wall. Then she backed out of the freezer and stood in the corridor and breathed air that was cold, but not as cold as what she had been standing in, and she waited for her hands to stop shaking. Cole came out of the freezer and stood close beside her. He looked up at her face with the particular attention he gave things he was genuinely uncertain about. "What is it?" "A combination to something," she said. "To what?" She looked back at the freezer door, the old insulated door with the old brass lock that had been maintained so it would open when the right key arrived. The door that opened onto a room with empty shelves and a false wall and numbers carved in mortar and an active refrigeration system running on the other side of that false wall for a reason that was not yet named. "I don't know yet," she said, which was true. She had a combination to something she hadn't found. She had a room that was being kept cold on purpose. She had a wall with hollow space behind it. She had a grandfather who had driven the same truck for 30 years and worn the same boots until they failed and never once discussed money with anyone who might remember him discussing it. She thought about Dennis in the parking lot, certain of the property's worthlessness. She thought about Brandon Merritt's practice smile and his $120,000 offer and the shelf life he had assigned to it. She thought about the urgency in Merritt's positioning, the particular pressure of someone who wanted to close a deal before the new owner had too much time to look around. She thought about Walter Griggs's carefully chosen words. There are aspects of the property that I believe he felt should be explained in person. She put Earl's index card back in her pocket. She took Cole's hand. Let's go get something warm to eat, she said. And then we're coming back. Cole nodded, steady and serious, 7 years old, and already understanding that some things needed to be approached after you had gathered yourself. Okay, he said. And then we find what the combination opens. They walked back through the workroom, through the old retail space, and out into the November afternoon, and the door swung shut behind them with the solid weight of something that had been holding itself in reserve for a long time. She walked to her car without looking back at the building, but she felt it at her back, the concrete block and the faded green paint, and somewhere inside it a wall with hollow space behind it and numbers carved for her to find. Felt it the way you felt the presence of something large and patient that had been waiting and was now paying close attention. She didn't know yet what Earl Calloway had hidden behind that wall. She didn't know what the 12-digit combination would open, or whether a man who had driven the same truck for 30 years and never discussed money had been concealing something that would reorganize every calculation she had ever made about her own life. She didn't know about the phone calls that were already being made by people who had been watching this property longer than she had known it existed, or about the decisions that were coming, or about how much courage it would take to stand still when everything started moving. She knew that Cole was hungry and that the brake was still broken and that rent was due in 9 days. And she knew that her grandfather, who had given her very little except patience and time and 20 minutes of refrigeration science on a summer afternoon when she was 10 years old, had left her this building deliberately, specifically, after years of careful thought, with a letter sealed in his handwriting and a card with a clue in his hand, because he had believed that she was the one who came when something mattered, and because he had something to tell her that he had never been able to say out loud. The Millstone Diner had been on the corner of Main and 4th since before Harlan had needed reasons to stay, which was to say it had been there long enough that it no longer felt like a business so much as a geological feature, something the town had grown around and would not know how to exist without. The booths were upholstered in burgundy vinyl that had seen better decades. The coffee was the kind that had been brewed in the same type of urn in the same corner for 50 years and tasted like institutional sincerity, thick and honest, and not particularly elegant. Maya ordered 2 cups without asking if they had anything better. Cole ordered hot chocolate and a grilled cheese and immediately pressed his face to the diner window to watch the street outside, the way children watched the world when they were processing something large and hadn't finished yet. She put Earl's letter on the table in front of her and looked at it for a moment before opening it. The envelope was heavier than she had expected when Walter Griggs handed it over. Thick paper, the kind that cost money, which was itself an anomaly because Earl had spent his life making choices that didn't cost more than they needed to. He had reused plastic bags until they failed. He had darned his own socks. He had driven a 1989 Ford pickup from the year of its manufacture until the year of his death, patching it, replacing parts, declining every suggestion that it was time to move on to something newer. A man who chose thick stationery for his final letter was a man who had decided that what he was writing down was worth the extra cost of paper that would last. She broke the seal and unfolded 2 pages of his handwriting, the same deliberate, careful script from the index card, but slower here, more considered, the handwriting of someone who had revised what they wanted to say many times before sitting down to write the final version. My dear Maya, I am going to tell you the truth about something I should have said out loud while I was alive to say it. The fact that I'm saying it this way instead is a failure of courage that I am not proud of and cannot entirely explain, except to say that the older you get, the harder certain conversations become, and I ran out of time before I ran out of difficulty. You are the only person in my family who ever came without wanting something. I don't mean that as a criticism of the others. People want things. That's natural. But you came to sit with me and bring that boy of yours. And you asked me questions about my work because you were genuinely curious about the answers, not because you were calculating what I might leave behind. That is a rarer quality than most people know. I grew up watching my father lose everything. This was 1938. I was 5 years old, and I watched a man who had worked every day of his adult life stand in front of an empty bank and understand that the numbers the bank had been keeping on his behalf did not exist anymore. They had never existed in any form he could touch or hold or carry out of a building. They were just marks on paper, and the paper had stopped meaning anything, and everything my father had built evaporated because he had trusted the meaning of numbers to people he had never met and who did not know his name. I decided very young that I would never trust a number I couldn't hold in my hand. When I built this business, I ran it honestly, and I paid my taxes, and I kept my accounts like any legitimate businessman kept accounts. But the cash this shop generated over 50 years of operation, the cash I didn't need to live on, the surplus, I did not put it in a bank. I did not invest it in stocks or bonds or any other form of number on paper. I converted it into the only thing that has held its value across every catastrophe human beings have devised in the last 5,000 years. What you're about to find behind that wall is the accumulation of 40 years of careful, deliberate conversion. I started in 1974 when I was 41 years old and Nixon had just taken the country off the gold standard, and I understood that the numbers were going to get less reliable, not more. I continued until 2014 when my hands stopped being steady enough for the work I was doing. In that time I bought what I could, when I could, from dealers across 3 states who each knew me as a different name and none of whom knew the full picture. I am telling you this now because you need to understand what you have found is not an accident. It is not luck. It is 50 years of a man who understood one thing clearly and acted on that understanding every day until he couldn't anymore. What you are inheriting is not just metal. It is the proof that a person who starts with nothing and keeps his head down and converts every surplus dollar into something real can build something that will outlast him by generations. I don't know exactly what it's worth in the year you're reading this. When I last had it appraised in 2019, the figure was $212 million. Gold prices have moved since then. I expect they have moved upward because they always do when the world becomes more uncertain, and the world, in my experience, has a strong preference for becoming more uncertain. I am leaving it to you because you are the one who comes. Because you brought coal. Because you asked me what the cold storage smelled like and you listened to the answer. Because your grandmother, who was the best person I ever knew, told me the year before she died that you were the one in this family who understood that some things mattered more than comfort, and I believed her then, and I believe her now. There is a combination dial in the wall. You'll find it when you put your hands on the false section and feel past the surface. The numbers you found are the combination in 3 groups of 4. The first group opens the protective cover. The second and third groups open the dial itself. Go slowly. The mechanism is old, but it works. I have tested it every year until I couldn't make the trip anymore. I am sorry I couldn't tell you this face to face. I am sorry I let pride and stubbornness keep me from the kind of conversation that would have been better for both of us. I loved your grandmother more than I could ever say clearly, and I love this family in the imperfect and insufficient way that men of my generation learned to love things, which is to say badly expressed, but genuinely meant. Take care of that boy. Take care of yourself. Do something good with what you find. You'll know what that means when you see it. Your grandfather, Earl Meyer, read the letter twice, sitting in the burgundy vinyl booth with her coffee going cold and Cole watching the street outside and the sound of the diner moving around her, the clatter of dishes and the murmur of conversations and the particular music of a place that had been absorbing the small dramas of a town's daily life for decades. She folded the letter along its original creases and put it back in the envelope with the careful deliberateness of someone handling something that needed to be treated as the document it was, not the piece of paper it looked like. $212 million in 2019. She held the number in her mind the way you held something very heavy, with both hands, carefully, aware that it could do damage if it shifted unexpectedly. She thought about Dennis in the parking lot, about his voice when he said she was barely keeping herself above water. She thought about the break on her Civic and the field trip deposit and the 9 days until rent. She thought about the warehouse in Cleveland and Bay 7 and the flickering fluorescent lights and 4 years of $12 an hour math that never quite added up to enough. She thought about a 5-year-old boy in a cold storage room, holding an old man's hand, learning why temperature mattered. Cole had turned from the window. He was watching her face with the dark-eyed attention he brought to everything that mattered. He had not asked about the letter while she read it because he understood, in the way he understood things, that some moments required waiting. What did he say? Cole asked. Maya looked at her son for a long moment. She thought about how to answer and decided the honest answer was the only one worth giving. He said there's something behind the wall, she said. Something he spent 40 years putting there. Something worth a great deal of money. Cole processed this with his usual steady gravity. How much? She considered how to explain numbers that large to a 7-year-old. More money than either of us has ever seen or thought about, she said. More money than most people see in 100 lifetimes. Cole absorbed this with the expression of someone integrating new information into an existing framework and checking whether the framework needed to be rebuilt or just expanded. Is that why Uncle Dennis was so angry in the parking lot? Because he knew? I don't think Dennis knew. I think Dennis wanted the property because he believed what he told us, that it was worth 90 or 100,000 and he deserved to have it. I don't think he knew what Grandpa Earl was keeping inside. Otherwise, he wouldn't have just been angry, Cole said thoughtfully. He would have been scared. She looked at her son, 7 years old, and already understanding that the emotion a person showed was not always the emotion driving them, and that the gap between those two things was where the real information lived. That's right, she said. Cole drank his hot chocolate. He picked up his grilled cheese and ate one half of it in methodical bites, thinking, and then he set the second half down and looked at her directly. Mom, what are we going to do? She looked out the diner window at Harlan's Main Street, at the brick buildings and the quiet Saturday afternoon movement of a small town going about its business. She thought about Walter Griggs in his dense, careful office. She thought about Earl's letter, specifically the last real line before the signature. Do something good with what you find. First, she said, we go back and open what he left us. She picked up her coffee and finished it, cold as it was, because finishing things mattered. Then we figure out the rest. They paid at the counter and walked back through the November afternoon to her car and drove the 6 blocks to Industrial Loop Road and parked in front of Calloway's Meats, and Maya sat in the driver's seat for a moment before getting out, feeling the particular quality of a moment that was about to divide time into before and after. She got out of the car. Cole got out beside her. They walked to the front door together, and she unlocked it again, and they went inside. The cold settled around them as it had before, that specific layered cold of a building that remembered its own work. She moved through the retail space and the workroom without pausing, directly to the cold storage corridor, directly to the third door at the end of the turn, and she opened it with the old brass key and stepped inside. The back freezer was exactly as she had left it. Empty shelves, painted concrete floor worn back to gray at the paths of movement. Overhead light casting its clean and functional illumination. The back wall with its central section of smoother mortar, and at the top corner, the 12 digits she had photographed and memorized. Earl's letter had told her, feel past the surface. She crossed to the false wall section and put both palms flat against it, not pressing hard, but applying even gentle pressure, moving her hands slowly across the surface the way you moved your hands across something you were trying to read by touch. The painted mortar was cold and smooth under her palms. She worked across the width of the section at one height, then moved her hands down a foot and worked across again. Midway down the wall, at approximately chest height, near the left edge of the central section, her fingertips crossed something different. A seam. Faint, the width of a single line, running vertically for about 2 inches. She pressed more carefully at that spot. The surface didn't yield to pressure, but she could feel under her fingertips that the texture changed slightly, that the paint here was covering metal rather than the rough aggregate surface of mortar. A straight edge where the curved and irregular surface of a concrete block should be. She moved her hands to the right from that seam, searching. 6 inches across, she found the opposing seam. Running vertically, same depth, same character. She traced both seams upward with her index fingers and found them converging at the top into a horizontal line and descending to a horizontal line at the bottom. A rectangle, roughly 8 inches wide and 10 inches tall, set at chest height in the left half of the false wall section, with a surface covering that looked like mortar and was not. She pressed the center of the rectangle firmly with the heel of her hand. It moved inward by 1/4 of an inch with a resistance that spoke of a spring mechanism, tight from years of cold and disuse, but functional. When she released pressure, it sprang back flush. Not a push to open. Locked. She looked at the 12 digits she had photographed. 4 and 4 and 4. Earl's letter had said the first group opens the protective cover, which meant this panel had its own release mechanism, separate from the main combination. She looked more carefully at the panel's edges. In the bottom right corner of the rectangle, where the painted surface met the false mortar, she saw it only because she was looking at exactly the right angle, a small raised dot, a button almost flush with the surface, the size of a pencil eraser. She pressed it with her fingertip. The rectangle swung inward on a recessed hinge. Behind it, a numerical keypad, 12 keys, digital display showing a row of dashes. First group of 4, Earl had said. She entered the first 4 digits of the number she had found carved in the mortar. The display blinked. Then it showed a green indicator, and she heard from behind the wall a mechanism engage with a sound like tumblers in a very large lock beginning to move. Behind the keypad, she could now see a combination dial, the kind set into a steel door, polished and black, with numbers running around its circumference and a chrome handle to the side. She reached in, took hold of the dial with steady fingers, and began working through the remaining 8 digits the way a person worked through a combination lock they had been given the numbers to, carefully, counting turns. Left to the second group of numbers. Right to the third group. Left again to 0. She felt the mechanism complete itself in the wall. A deep internal click, solid and definitive, the sound of something that had been locked for a very long time releasing its grip. She looked at the handle beside the dial. It was chrome, shaped to fit the hand, designed to be gripped and pulled. She gripped it. She pulled. The wall moved. Not the entire wall section, just the central part, but it moved as a single piece, swinging toward her on concealed hinges embedded in the floor and ceiling. And as it moved, she understood that what she had been looking at was not a section of rebuilt concrete block at all, but a steel door faced with a thin layer of material made to look like concrete block, painted to match the surrounding wall, maintained carefully enough over decades that the simulation had been nearly perfect. The door was 6 inches thick. The steel was cold under her hand as she pulled it fully open, and the smell that came out of the space beyond was the same as the freezer but older, denser, the cold of a space that had been sealed and maintained in isolation for a very long time. She reached inside for a light switch and found it where she would have put it herself, on the right side just inside the door, and she flipped it. The fluorescent tube overhead buzzed, flickered twice, and came on. She stood in the doorway of a room that was 8 feet wide and 14 feet deep, with a ceiling of exposed conduit and a floor of bare concrete, and on 3 walls floor-to-ceiling steel shelving units of the same commercial grade as the shelving in the freezer outside. And on the shelves, stacked with the orderly precision of a man who had spent his working life managing inventory, were gold bars. Not 1 or 2, not a small collection. Stacks of them, arranged by size, organized by what she could only assume was acquisition date or assay marking, with the systematic logic of someone who had been adding to this collection for decades and had needed to keep track of what was there. Standard bars, the kind she recognized from photographs, rectangular and dense, with the particular warm color that gold held even in fluorescent light, even in cold. Smaller bars arranged in separate stacks. Individual 1-ounce pieces in sealed cases on the lower shelves. And running across all 3 walls, floor to shoulder height, the accumulated weight of 40 years of conversion. Her legs stopped working. She sat down on the concrete floor of the vault room, her back against the doorframe, and looked at what her grandfather had built in the back of his butcher shop for 50 years without telling a single person. Cole appeared in the doorway beside her a moment later. He had been standing in the freezer, waiting, and he had heard the mechanism and the door and understood that the moment had arrived. He stood in the doorway and looked into the vault room for a long time without speaking. Then he said, very quietly, "He really did save it all." Maya could not speak. She put her hand over her mouth and breathed through her nose and looked at the shelves and thought about a man who had grown up watching a bank failure and decided that the only thing he trusted was the thing he could hold, and who had held on to that conviction for 6 decades while the world around him said he was wrong, while everyone who knew him assumed he was a modest man living a modest life and leaving behind a modest legacy, while his own children had assessed his estate and found nothing remarkable and moved on. He had been here the whole time. The whole time. Cole sat down beside her on the cold concrete floor, close enough that their shoulders touched, and did not say anything else, because sometimes there was nothing else to say, and he understood that. After a while, Maya wiped her face with the back of her hand and stood up. She moved into the vault room and looked more carefully at what was there. Every shelf held bars of various sizes, and every bar had a small label attached to it in Earl's handwriting: date of acquisition, weight in troy ounces, name of the dealer. The labels were tiny, precise, comprehensive. She pulled one standard bar from the nearest stack and held it in both hands. It was heavier than she had expected, the particular heaviness of dense metal that reminded your body of its own limitations. The bar was marked with an assay stamp, a refiner's mark, a weight designation for 100 troy ounces. She set it back carefully. At the far end of the vault room, on a small shelf at eye level that held no gold but only a single sealed envelope and a small ledger, Earl had left his final accounting. She reached for the envelope first and found it addressed in the same handwriting as the first, simply, for when you're ready to know the number. Inside, a single sheet, handwritten, dated November 2019. Total acquisition records enclosed in the ledger. Approximate current market value as of this writing, based on gold price of $1,478 per troy ounce, $212,400,000. Total troy ounces held, 143,705. Purchases made between 1974 and 2014. Original cost of acquisition across all purchases, approximately $28 million, representing a surplus from 40 years of business operation converted at various price points. The ledger is complete. Every purchase documented. Every bar labeled. The provenance of this collection is unimpeachable. I bought every ounce legally. I paid taxes on the business income that generated the capital. What I did with that capital was my business and no one else's. At current prices, this collection is worth approximately $212 million. By the time you read this, prices will likely have moved. They usually move up. It is yours. Do something good with it. I trust you to know what that means. Maya looked at the ledger. 40 years of entries in Earl's careful script, each one dated, each one recording a purchase that looked individually modest and collectively staggering. 10 ounces here, 50 ounces there, 100 ounces in a year when business had been particularly strong. Year after year, the entries accumulated, each one a deliberate act of conversion, a man trading paper for the thing that paper was supposed to represent. She pulled out her phone and searched the current price of gold. The result loaded slowly on Harland's cellular network. $2,312 per troy ounce. She did the multiplication on the phone's calculator with hands that were completely steady, which surprised her, because inside she was not steady at all. She was the furthest thing from steady she had ever been. But her hands moved with the practiced precision of a woman who had spent 4 years running inventory at 2 in the morning and had learned that some work required steadiness regardless of what you felt. 143,705 troy ounces multiplied by $2,312. She looked at the result for a long moment. 328,232,440. The number did not feel real. Numbers that large did not feel real. But neither did this room, this vault, these shelves, this accumulated weight of a man's 50-year conviction. And the room was real. She was standing in it. The floor was cold under her boots, and the light was buzzing faintly above, and the gold was exactly as dense and warm-colored as it appeared in every photograph she had ever seen of gold, because it was not a photograph. It was here. It was hers. She stepped back out of the vault room and into the freezer. Cole was still sitting on the floor, though he had pulled out his book and opened it, which was his way of giving her space to process without leaving her alone. He looked up when she came out. "How much?" he asked. She told him. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at his book, then back at her. "Mom," he said, "we're going to need a lawyer." She almost laughed. She might have laughed if the sound her chest made when she tried wasn't something more complicated and harder to name. "We have a lawyer. A better one. Walter Griggs has been honest with us so far." Cole considered this. "Okay, then we need to call him." She called him. Walter Griggs answered on the second ring, and when she told him what she had found, there was a silence on his end that lasted long enough for her to understand that whatever he had suspected about the property, whatever had been behind his careful words about aspects that deserved explanation in person, it had not been this. His voice, when he found it, was the voice of a man recalibrating carefully. "I see," he said, which was clearly not adequate but was honest. "I see." A pause. Are you safe? Is the property secure? Both. We're inside. The front door is locked. Don't leave, Walter said. Don't let anyone else in. I'm coming to you right now. Another pause, and when he spoke again his voice had found its footing. Maya, don't call anyone else until I get there. Not family, not anyone. Can you do that? She looked at Cole, sitting on the freezer floor with his book. She looked at the vault door standing open behind her, the shelves visible through the opening. I can do that, she said. Walter arrived in 14 minutes, which meant he had driven faster than a 72-year-old attorney typically drove on a Saturday afternoon, a fact that told her something about his understanding of the situation's urgency. He came in with snow on his coat and his wire-rimmed glasses slightly fogged from the cold, and she led him directly to the back freezer and let him see the vault. He stood in the doorway for a long time without speaking. Then he went inside. He moved along the shelving units the way she had moved, looking at labels, pulling one bar to check its weight, reading the assay markings. He looked at the ledger. He read Earl's accounting sheet. When he came back out his face had a quality she couldn't quite characterize, somewhere between professional gravity and something more personal, the expression of a man learning something new about someone he had known for a long time. He never told me, Walter said, not accusingly, more like someone noting a fact that made a particular kind of sense in retrospect. 40 years he was my client. I drafted his will 3 times. He never said a word about this. He didn't trust banks, Maya said. Walter looked at her. He didn't trust anyone, he said quietly. Not about money. Not about this. He paused. He trusted you. Something about being told that, standing in the back of her grandfather's butcher shop next to a vault full of gold bars, broke something loose in Maya's chest that she hadn't known was held tight. She stood very still and breathed through it. Walter was already in practical mode, the mode of a man who had spent 40 years knowing what to do when things became complicated. He sat down on the low shelf of the empty commercial unit outside the vault and pulled out a small notepad. All right, first things first. The gold is yours. The legal documentation is clean, the property transfer is complete, and Earl's ledger establishes the providence of every acquisition. This collection is as legally unimpeachable as it's possible for a collection of this nature to be. He made a note. What we need immediately is authentication and valuation by a qualified precious metals expert, not a local jeweler. Someone with the credentials to produce a report that will hold up to scrutiny from any direction. What direction would that come from? Walter looked at her over his glasses with the expression of a man choosing how much to say at once. Maya, you have just inherited roughly $300 million in gold, in a building that your uncle contested in probate court and lost. In a town where a developer has been trying to acquire this specific property, there will be scrutiny from multiple directions, and we need to be ahead of all of it. He wrote a name and a phone number on the notepad and tore the page out. James Whitfield. He runs the most credible precious metals authentication firm in Ohio. I have used him on 2 estate matters. He is thorough, credentialed, and discreet. Call him Monday morning. Monday. She looked at the vault. I'm not leaving this building. Walter held her gaze. You can't stay in here indefinitely. I can stay here tonight. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at Cole, who was sitting against the corridor wall, reading his book with the focused composure of a child who had decided that the adults needed space to work things out. He looked back at Maya. The building is legally yours. The property is secure. If you want to remain on site tonight, that's your right. He stood, putting the notepad back in his pocket. But I want Harold Fry to come by. Who is Harold Fry? He was Harlan's chief of police for 22 years. He retired 2 years ago. He is the most trusted person in this town, and his family has lived here for 4 generations. Walter's voice was measured and precise, the voice of someone who had thought about who to trust in a crisis and arrived at a list. He can make sure no one accesses this property tonight while you decide what to do. I would also like to be the first call if anyone contacts you about the property. Do you understand why that matters? She thought about Dennis. She thought about Merritt's shelf life comment. She thought about Walter Griggs's 14-minute drive. Yes. Good. He moved toward the freezer door, then stopped. He turned back. Maya, Earl spent a great deal of time thinking about who to leave this to. He revised that will twice in the last 10 years, and both times your name stayed exactly where he put it. He paused, the careful voice giving way briefly to something more personal. He told me once, the year before he died, that the only thing he regretted was not finding a way to say certain things while he could still say them. I think what he left you here is his attempt to say them anyway. He put his glasses back straight on his nose and moved toward the door. I'll call Harold. Lock the front door behind me. After Walter left, Maya stood in the cold storage corridor and allowed herself 1 minute of stillness, of complete unguarded stillness, before she put herself back together. She thought about her apartment in Cleveland, the 2 bedrooms, the dripping faucet her landlord had been promising to fix for 8 months. She thought about the warehouse, Bay 7, the flickering lights. She thought about the break. She thought about 4 years of arithmetic that never added up to enough, of falling asleep calculating and waking up calculating and spending every hour in between managing the gap between what things cost and what she had to pay for them. She thought about Earl Calloway, 31 years old, building a butcher shop on a plot of land in a small Ohio town because he understood one thing clearly and intended to act on that understanding every day. She thought about him walking into this room year after year, adding to what was on those shelves, not because he was greedy but because he was afraid, and he had found the only thing that made the fear manageable, which was the thing you could hold. She was holding it now, in a different sense than he had held it, but she was holding it. Cole appeared in the corridor doorway. He had finished his book and tucked it in his backpack and was looking at her with those steady dark eyes that held more patience than most adults she knew. "Mom, what's next?" "We stay here tonight," she said. "We make sure this is safe. And Monday morning we call someone who can tell us exactly what we have." Cole looked at the vault door, still standing open, the shelves visible beyond. "We know what we have," he said. "We know the number. We need someone official to say the number out loud." "Why?" She thought about how to explain authentication and probate proceedings and the difference between possessing something and legally establishing that you possessed it to the satisfaction of every institution that would eventually need to be satisfied. "Because other people are going to question it," she said, "and we need to be ready for that." He nodded, accepting this the way he accepted most explanations when they were given honestly. "Okay." He paused. "Can we close the vault door for tonight? It feels weird to leave it open." She looked at the open vault door, the gold visible on the shelves. She crossed the freezer and swung it closed, heard the mechanism re-engage, and stood with her hand on the cold painted surface of the door that didn't look like a door, the wall that looked exactly like the wall around it. The call from Dennis came at 6:18 that evening. Maya was sitting in Earl's old office, a small room off the workroom she had discovered during her afternoon exploration, furnished with a metal desk and a rolling chair and a filing cabinet that held 40 years of business records and labeled folders. She had found a space heater in the corner that still functioned, and she had plugged it in and set Cole up with a blanket from his overnight bag and his second book from his backpack. And she was sitting at Earl's desk reading through the business ledgers, learning the shape of 50 years of operation, when the phone rang. She answered because it was Dennis's name on the screen, and she had decided that avoiding Dennis was a strategy with diminishing returns. "Merritt tells me you turned him down." Dennis's voice was controlled, but the control was costing him something. She could hear the cost of it. "Maya, be reasonable. That building is a money sink. Whatever sentimental attachment you have to it, it's not sentiment. Then what is it? You're going to move to Harlan? Leave your job? Do what with an empty building in a town with no economy?" She said nothing. "I've spoken to an attorney." His voice shifted, taking on the formal registry of someone reciting prepared language. "There are grounds to revisit the will based on Earl's mental capacity in his final years. He was 87. He had been alone for a decade. There is an argument to be made." "You already made that argument in probate court," she said. "The court dismissed it. That was a preliminary challenge. A full competency hearing is a different matter." She thought about Earl's letter, the precision and completeness of it, the careful logic of every choice he had made about how to leave things and to whom. She thought about a man who had tested his vault mechanism every year until he couldn't make the trip anymore, who had maintained the back freezer on a separate power circuit so it would still be running when someone finally came to find what was inside. She thought about how clearly Earl had understood exactly what he was doing and exactly why. "Do what you need to do, Dennis." She kept her voice even. "I'm going to do the same." She hung up and sat in Earl's chair in the quiet of the old office and listened to the space heater working. Cole looked up from his book. "Uncle Dennis?" "Uncle Dennis." He's going to make trouble, isn't he? He's going to try. She picked up the ledger again. That's different. The morning arrived gray and clear, the kind of November morning that offered good visibility and no comfort. Harold Fry had come by the previous evening, as Walter had arranged. A man in his late 60s with the unhurried authority of someone who had spent 22 years being the last line between Harlan's residents and the varieties of trouble they generated. He had walked the property perimeter, checked the fence, noted the sight lines, and told Maya matter-of-factly that he would drive past every 2 hours through the night and that she should call him if anything felt wrong. He had given her his number and not waited to be thanked. Nothing had felt wrong. The night had passed quietly inside a building that had held its secret for 50 years and saw no reason to be dramatic about it now. She called James Whitfield at 8:30 Monday morning. He answered with the efficient courtesy of someone who had built a practice on being reachable and said he could come Wednesday. She told him the nature of the collection, as specifically as she knew how to describe it. There was a pause on his end that she was beginning to recognize as the pause of people recalibrating. You said the ledger documents purchases back to 1974? First entry is April 1974. Last entry is March 2014. And you've done a rough count of what's on the shelves? 47 stacks of standard 400-ounce bars. 6 shelving units of smaller bars in various weights. 2 shelves of 1-ounce pieces in sealed cases. She had done this count herself, early in the morning, with Cole helping her tally. Another pause, longer. Miss Calloway, I'll come tomorrow. James Whitfield arrived the following morning in a late-model truck with a discreet magnetic sign on the door, Whitfield Precious Metals Assessment, and he brought with him a case of equipment that he carried with the careful efficiency of someone who had done this work for a long time. He was 50-something, precise in his movements, with the particular combination of skepticism and wonder that distinguished experts in rare things, people who had developed standards because the standards were real and were also capable of astonishment when those standards were met fully. He spent 3 hours in the vault. He worked without commentary, moving through the shelves with a methodical sequence, testing assay marks with his equipment, checking weights, cross-referencing with the labels, and with Earl's ledger, photographing every shelf from multiple angles. Maya stood in the freezer corridor and waited, and Cole sat beside her on the floor doing the math homework his teacher had sent via email, because the world kept its own schedule regardless of what was happening in back freezers. When Whitfield finally emerged and closed the vault door behind him, he stood in the freezer corridor for a moment and looked at Maya with an expression that she had not seen before and suspected she would not see often. The expression of someone who had just encountered something outside the ordinary parameters of their experience. I've assessed 4 major private collections in 25 years, he said. Nothing close to this. He reached into his case and produced a preliminary worksheet, numbers and calculations in tight rows. I'll need a week for the formal written report. Photographs, weight verification, provenance documentation, assay confirmation. But I can give you a preliminary figure right now. She waited. Based on current spot price and the verified weight from today's initial inspection, this collection has a current market value of approximately $328 million. He looked at the worksheet, then at her. Give or take. Based on final assay confirmation of the smaller pieces, it may be slightly higher. It will not be lower. He paused. Miss Calloway, where did this come from? She told him about Earl. About the depression and the bank failure and 40 years of deliberate conversion. She told him about the index card and the letter and the combination in the mortar. She told him that the man behind this collection had been a butcher in a small Ohio town who drove the same truck for 30 years and never mentioned money. Whitfield listened with a stillness that suggested he was doing more than just hearing the words. When she finished, he looked at the closed vault door for a moment. I've never seen documentation this comprehensive for a private accumulation, he said. Most people who hold gold informally keep imperfect records. Your grandfather kept records that would satisfy a bank examiner. He closed his case. Whoever receives this collection receives something with a clean and complete history. There will be no questions a proper attorney cannot answer. After he left, Maya sat in Earl's office for a long time with the preliminary worksheet in front of her, the number on it sitting steady in the clean handwriting of a professional whose job was not to be surprised, and who had been surprised anyway. $328 million. She thought about Brandon Merritt's offer. $120,000. as is, no inspection contingencies. She thought about Dennis's voice. She can barely keep herself above water. She thought about Bay 7 and the flickering lights and the scanner that beeped against frozen beef patties at 2 in the morning while her daughter slept 3 miles away and her brake made its expensive sound every time she stopped. She thought about Earl at the age of 5, watching his father stand in front of an empty bank. About Earl at 31, pouring the floor of this building himself, a man who started with nothing and kept his head down and converted every surplus dollar into something real, year after year, for 50 years. The number on the page did not feel real, but the room it described was real, and the gold on its shelves was real, and the ledger that documented every purchase was real, and the man who had built all of it from nothing and left it to the one member of his family who came when something mattered was real. She folded the worksheet and put it in the same pocket as Earl's letter. Cole appeared in the doorway. He had finished his homework and was watching her with those dark, attentive eyes that missed very little. Is it what the letter said? It's more, she said. It's more than the letter said. He came in and sat on the corner of the desk the way he sometimes sat on the corner of her desk in Cleveland, companionable and present without demanding anything. What are you thinking about? What comes next? Good things or bad things? She thought about Dennis and his attorney. She thought about Merritt's shelf life comment and his expensive truck and the 3 properties he had already acquired on the south end of town. She thought about a formal competency challenge, about the kind of legal machinery that powerful families could set in motion when they felt they had been denied something they were owed. She thought about what Walter had said, scrutiny from multiple directions. She thought about being a warehouse night shift worker with a broken brake and no expertise in precious metals law or estate litigation, suddenly sitting on $328 million that people with more resources and louder voices would insist she had no business holding. She thought about Earl's letter. The only thing he regretted was not finding a way to say certain things while he could still say them. Both, she said honestly. There are going to be people who don't want this to go the way it should go. Cole considered this. But it's ours. It is. And we have the ledger, and the combination, and the letter, and the lawyer found us the expert. We do. He looked at her steadily. Then we're going to be okay. He said it the way he said things when he had thought them through and arrived at a conclusion, not as wishful thinking, but as assessment. Because great-grandpa Earl didn't just leave us the gold. He left us everything we need to prove it's ours. He thought about all of it. She looked at her son for a long moment, at the 7-year-old who had sat on the floor of a vault room with his book and let her work through what she had found, who had asked the right questions and kept his head and understood before she did that what Earl had done was not just hide gold but build a case, document everything, leave a trail that only someone who deserved to follow it would find. The property was hers. The documentation was complete. The authentication was underway. The one honest lawyer in a 40-mile radius was on her side. And she had a 7-year-old boy who understood the situation more clearly than anyone who would come at them in the days ahead. She stood up from Earl's desk. We're going to be okay, she agreed. But we have work to do. She picked up her phone. Let's call Walter. We need to talk about what Dennis is planning and what Merritt is going to do when he finds out what this property actually holds. She looked at Earl's filing cabinet, the 40 years of meticulous business records. And then I want to understand what Earl built here. Not just the vault. All of it. The whole business. Because whatever I decide to do with what I've inherited, I want to understand where it came from. The phone buzzed in her hand before she could dial. The number on the screen was not one she recognized. She answered with the same wary tone she had used the first time, 8 days ago, when an unknown Ohio number had called her in a cold warehouse aisle at 2 in the morning. But it was not good news arriving this time. It was the other kind. Miss Calloway. The voice was male, professional, carrying the smooth and practiced authority of expensive legal training. My name is Gregory Alvarez. I represent Mr. Brandon Merritt and a group of investors with a significant interest in the property at 4 Industrial Loop Road. I'm calling to make you aware that my clients have filed an emergency motion in Lansing County Court this morning seeking a temporary restraining order on any disposition of property assets pending a full investigation into the estate's handling. A brief pause designed for effect. I would strongly encourage you to speak with your attorney before taking any further steps. My clients are prepared to be generous in reaching a resolution, but the window for that generosity is not indefinite. The call ended. Maya stood in Earl's office holding the phone, looking at the door of the room where she had slept 2 nights on a folding cot, and beyond that door the workroom, and beyond that the cold storage corridor, and at the end of it the back freezer, and behind its old brass-locked door the vault with its shelves and its stacks, and the 40 years of one man's stubborn faith in the only thing he believed held its value. She dialed Walter Griggs. He answered on the first ring. "I know," he said, before she could speak. "Gregory Alvarez called me an hour ago. I've already been in contact with a litigation attorney in Columbus." "Maya." His voice was steady and clear, and she recognized in it something she had come to understand about him. That his steadiness was not performance, but character, the quality of someone who had been doing hard things for a long time and had learned not to spend energy on what couldn't be controlled. "This is exactly what I told you to expect. They didn't know what the property held when they made the offer. Now they're trying to get in front of it legally before you can establish your position." He paused. "It's not going to work, but it's going to take time, and it's going to require you to be patient and disciplined." "How much time?" "A temporary restraining order of this kind, in a case with the documentation you have, will not survive its first hearing. A week, perhaps 2. Alvarez is buying time and making noise." Another pause. "But Maya, when this becomes public, it will become very public. A $300 million gold collection in a small-town butcher shop is not the kind of story that stays local. You need to be prepared for that." Cole was watching her from the corner of the desk. She met his eyes. "What does being prepared look like?" she asked. "It looks like not speaking to any journalists before speaking to me. It looks like not speaking to Merritt or Dennis or Alvarez directly. It looks like trusting the process and trusting that the documentation your grandfather left behind is as complete as it appears to be." Walter's voice carried something that might have been, under the professional restraint, a form of admiration. Earl spent 50 years thinking this through. He didn't leave gaps. "We're going to use every inch of the ground he gave us." She looked at Earl's filing cabinet. At the office he had sat in every day for 50 years, making the decisions that had brought her here. "Okay," she said. "One more thing." Walter hesitated for a fraction of a second, which was the longest hesitation she had heard from him. "James Whitfield called me this morning before you called him. He wanted to flag something in the preliminary inspection." A pause. "Several of the standard bars show assay marks from a refinery that stopped operating in 1991. That's consistent with acquisitions in the 1980s, which aligns with the ledger. But Whitfield wants to do additional verification on those specific bars. He says it's almost certainly nothing, just due diligence. But he wants to be thorough." "What would it mean if it was something?" "It would mean nothing about the legality of your ownership," Walter said carefully. "But it might mean questions about the bar's original provenance that we would want to be ahead of. I'm not suggesting there's a problem. I'm telling you because you deserve to know everything." After she hung up, she sat quietly in the old office with Cole beside her, and the space heater working against the November cold, and somewhere behind the false wall in the back freezer $328 million in gold that a dead man had left her because she was the one who came. The days ahead were not going to be simple. She had known that since the parking lot. She had known it since Walter Griggs had used the careful voice and chosen his words with such precision, since Dennis had brought Merritt on a Saturday morning and called her offer a fool's errand, since a lawyer she had never heard of had filed a motion to restrict what she could do with what was legally and unambiguously hers. But she was the daughter of a butcher's daughter and the great-granddaughter of a man who had watched a bank fail and decided that the only thing worth trusting was the thing you could hold. She had held things before. She had been holding things for 4 years in a cold warehouse aisle, alone at 2 in the morning, with flickering lights and a broken brake and 9 days until rent. She had been holding things her whole adult life. She knew how to hold on. Cole put his book in his bag and looked at her with the steady dark eyes that had been paying attention to all of it, since the phone call in the parking lot of Walter Griggs's office, since the diner, since the combination dial in the freezer wall. He looked at her the way Earl must have looked at things when he was 5 years old, standing in front of an empty bank, deciding what he believed in. "Mom," he said. "Yeah, baby. We're going to need to be brave." She thought about Earl, who had been brave in the quiet and patient way that did not look like bravery because it didn't announce itself, the bravery of a man who kept converting every surplus dollar into the thing he believed in, year after year, without telling anyone, without needing anyone to see him doing it. The bravery of working in the dark and trusting that the work would matter. "I know," she said, "but we know how to do that." She stood up from her grandfather's desk for the last time before everything changed, before the lawyers and the journalists, and the institutional machinery of scrutiny that Walter had told her to expect. She stood up in the room where Earl Calloway had sat every working day of his adult life, managing the accounts of a small business that everyone around him had seen for exactly what it appeared to be and nothing more. She looked at Cole. "Let's go make sure the vault is secure," she said. "And then let's figure out what we're going to do with what he gave us." The Lansing County Courthouse was a building that had been designed in a period when public institutions were expected to communicate solidity, the kind of architecture that said whatever happened inside these walls would be handled with deliberate permanence. Maya sat beside Walter Griggs in the courtroom's second row on a Wednesday morning, 10 days after James Whitfield had left with his equipment case and his preliminary figure, and she watched Gregory Alvarez arrange his documents at the plaintiff's table with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this many times and expected to do it many times more. Alvarez was Merritt's attorney, and he was good at what he did, which was take situations that were legally imperfect and make them feel inevitable through the right combination of procedural motion and confident projection. He had filed his emergency TRO on a Monday morning, which was a move designed to create urgency and pressure before Maya had fully found her footing. He had named her personally as a respondent alongside the estate. He had attached a 20-page brief that questioned the competency of the estate's handling, cited procedural irregularities that Walter had already addressed, and suggested in language carefully chosen to avoid being specific that the collection might have been improperly assessed. None of it was solid. Walter had told her that in the car on the way here, specifically, and with the confidence of someone who had read the brief 3 times and found its foundation wanting at every load-bearing point. But solid and effective were different qualities in a courtroom, and Maya had sat up the previous night reading through everything Alvarez had filed, not because she could evaluate its legal merit, but because she refused to walk into this room having only been told what to think rather than having looked at the thing herself. Judge Patricia Howell had the expression of someone who had been sitting on a county bench for 18 years and had developed the particular patience of someone who had seen every variety of motion filed for every variety of reason and could distinguish between the genuine and the performative with the efficiency of long practice. She read through Alvarez's brief with an attention that gave nothing away. Walter presented their response with an orderly precision that Maya had come to understand was his natural mode rather than a performance of it. The estate proceedings were complete and certified. The probate challenge had been heard and dismissed. The property transfer was documented, legal, and without condition. The collection had been authenticated by a credentialed expert whose report was attached and whose credentials were also attached. There was no procedural irregularity because there was no procedure that had been skipped or rushed. Everything had followed the sequence that the law specified, in the order the law specified, with the documentation the law required. When Alvarez argued that the extraordinary value of the discovery created grounds for further court oversight, Judge Howell looked at him over the top of her reading glasses with an expression that suggested she was familiar with this argument and had not found it more compelling the previous time she had encountered it. "Counsel," she said, "the value of an inherited asset has no bearing on the validity of the inheritance. Are you suggesting the respondent's ownership would be more legitimate if the collection were worth less?" Alvarez began an answer. The judge raised one hand briefly, a gesture that did not need to be completed. The motion was denied in 11 minutes. Not deferred, not taken under advisement. Denied, with a note in the ruling that the filing appeared to have been brought for the purpose of delay rather than legitimate legal remedy. Maya walked out of the courthouse into a November morning that had turned briefly towards something almost like warmth. The kind of midday November light that reminded you summer had not been entirely erased, only set aside. She stood on the courthouse steps with Walter beside her and felt the particular quality of attention that had been sustained for 10 days releasing its grip. "That's the first one," Walter said, not dismissively, just accurately. "There will be others, but they won't get better as they go. The documentation gets stronger every day, not weaker." She nodded, looking out at Harlan's main street, at the brick buildings and the ordinary Tuesday traffic of a small town that had not yet learned what was sitting in a building on Industrial Loop Road. "The other thing," she said, "Whitfield's question about the pre-91 bars. He called me this morning. Walter's voice carried the particular relief of a worry resolved cleanly. His additional verification is complete. The bars in question carry assay marks from the Meridian Refinery, which was acquired by Continental Metals in 1990 and continued operating under the new ownership through 1993. The restamping was standard procedure under acquisition, not an irregularity. The bars are legitimate. The chain of custody is documented, and the final weight verification confirms the preliminary figure within 1/3%. He paused. $328 million for $100,000, adjusted for final assay. Whitfield's formal report will be ready Friday. She turned this over. The number had not changed meaningfully, just sharpened from preliminary to final, from estimate to certified fact. It felt different to have it certified. Not larger, but more solid. More like the floor under her feet, and less like something she was trying not to look directly at for fear it would move. Okay, she said. What's next? The story broke on a Thursday. She had known it was coming. The same way you knew a weather system was coming when you could see it building on the horizon for days, and she had made her preparations. She had spoken to Walter. She had called her mother Diane, which had been a difficult conversation carried out with the careful honesty it deserved, and Diane had wept in a way that was complicated by grief and guilt and the particular sorrow of learning that her father had been someone she hadn't fully seen. She had called Sarah, a friend from Cleveland, and Mrs. Antonescu, who had been quietly holding things together on the Cleveland end without asking for anything. She had told Cole, in terms he could understand, that people were going to start paying attention, and that paying attention was not always comfortable. Cole had thought about this and said that was okay because they hadn't done anything wrong. The journalist who wrote the first piece was a woman named Patricia Dorn who worked for the Columbus Dispatch and had been tipped off by someone in the county court records office after the TRO was filed, because court filings were public record and Patricia Dorn was the kind of reporter who read them. The article was factual, measured, and carried a headline that had the quality of something inevitable. Single mother discovers $328 million gold vault hidden in inherited butcher shop. The article stayed local for approximately 4 hours. Then it did not stay local anymore. Maya's phone started ringing at 11 in the morning and did not stop. She sat in Earl's office with it face down on the desk and let Walter handle the calls, which was what she had agreed to the night before when Walter had said, with the steadiness of someone issuing instructions to a person who needed to hear them clearly, that she was not to speak to any journalist, any television producer, any financial institution, or any representative of any gallery, collection, or investment interest without speaking to him first. She had agreed to this not because she was afraid of conversation, but because she understood that the next several weeks would be full of people who wanted something specific from her, and that the only way to remain clear-headed about what she actually wanted was to create space between herself and the people who would try to fill that space with their own preferences. Cole spent the morning at the kitchen table, still doing his school correspondence work with the disciplined focus of a 7-year-old who had decided that school was not going to be disrupted by circumstances, regardless of their scale. He came to the office doorway at noon. "Mom, there's someone at the front door." She had expected journalists. She had expected Merritt or his representatives. She had expected any number of people whose interests were legible and could be addressed by closing the door and calling Walter. She had not expected Dennis. He stood on the front step of Calloway's Meats in a heavy coat she recognized from family occasions, his hands in his pockets, his broad shoulders carrying a different kind of weight than they had carried in the parking lot outside Walter Griggs's office 2 weeks ago. The weight in the parking lot had been the weight of anger performing certainty. The weight she saw now was the weight of a man who had been confronted with something he could not argue away and was still trying to decide what to do with it. She opened the door, but did not step back to invite him in. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked past her into the old retail space, at the covered display cases and the equipment under its cloths, at the building his father had built and operated for 50 years and chosen to leave to someone who was not his son. "Patricia Dorn called me for comment," Dennis said. His voice was stripped of the controlled register she had heard in the parking lot. It was the voice of a man who had been taken out of his prepared position and was speaking without the script. "I didn't know what to say to her because I didn't know what was in this building." He paused. "I spent 2 years telling attorneys and a probate court that my father wasn't in his right mind. I spent 2 years saying the will was the product of a man who was too old and too isolated to make clear decisions. Another pause, longer. And now I'm reading that he built a $300 million vault in the back of his butcher shop by himself over 40 years and documented every single purchase in a ledger that a professional authenticator says is the most comprehensive private metals record he's ever seen. He stopped. A muscle in his jaw moved. He knew exactly what he was doing, Dennis said. Every day of his life, he knew exactly what he was doing. Maya looked at her uncle. She thought about a number of things she could say. She thought about Earl's letter, the line about leaving things to Maya because she came without wanting something, and she thought about whether that line had been a statement about Maya or a statement about everyone else, and she decided it was probably both because honest observations usually were. Come in, she said. She took him back to Earl's office, not to the vault because that was not what this conversation was about. She made coffee on the small machine she had brought from Cleveland because Earl's had stopped working, and she poured 2 cups and sat across from Dennis at Earl's desk and let him have the silence until he knew what he wanted to say. I was a bad son to him, Dennis said finally. I don't mean I was cruel. I just mean I was absent in the way that matters more. I came at Christmas and called on birthdays and thought that was enough. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup the way a person did when they needed something solid to hold. He called me once, maybe 2009 or 2010, and said he wanted to talk about the business. About what he'd built. I told him I was busy. I told him I'd come down the following month. His voice dropped a register. I never came. Maya was quiet. I'm not asking you for anything. Dennis looked up at her, and she saw in his face something she hadn't seen before. The expression of a man who had spent 2 years building a legal case against a dead father's decision and had just finished understanding why the decision had been made. I just needed to say that out loud somewhere that it would mean something. He looked at the filing cabinet, the 40 years of meticulous records. He knew I wouldn't come. He knew exactly which one of us would come, because he'd been watching for 40 years to see who showed up. He shook his head, a movement that contained grief and something like respect. Stubborn old man. Maya thought about Earl's letter. The only thing he regretted was not finding a way to say certain things while he could still say them. She thought about a man who had packed what he needed to say into a sealed letter and a vault full of gold because he had run out of other ways to say it. He built all of this because he loved us, she said. Not to comfort Dennis, but because it was true and it needed to be said in a room where his absence had been sitting for 2 years. He built it because he watched his father lose everything, and he decided he would not let that happen to his family. He kept it secret because he was afraid that knowing about it would do what money always does to people who know it's coming. She looked at Dennis steadily. He was right about that, wasn't he? Dennis was quiet for a long time. Then, he was right about most things. A pause. I've instructed my attorney to withdraw the competency challenge. You'll receive the formal notice today. He stood, leaving his coffee half drunk on the desk. I don't know what you're planning to do with what he left you. I expect you'll do something he would have approved of. He moved toward the door, then stopped. That boy of yours. Cole. What's he like? He's the kind of kid who asks the right questions and then waits for the real answer. Dennis made a sound that was almost a laugh, tired and genuine. Sounds like Dad. He left. She sat in the office and heard the front door close and heard his car start in the parking lot and drive away. She sat for a while after the sound faded, in the quiet of the building that had been holding this story for 50 years. Cole appeared in the doorway. He had heard some of it. She could tell from his face that he had heard enough. Is he okay? Cole asked. He will be, she said. He's working through something. What is he working through? She thought about how to answer this honestly for a 7-year-old. He's understanding that his father made a choice that told him something true about himself, she said. That's hard to hear even when the truth is something you already knew. Cole thought about this. I think I understand that, he said, in the tone he used when he wasn't entirely sure he understood it, but intended to keep thinking about it until he did. Brandon Merritt's situation resolved itself in a way that had not required Maya to do anything except let the facts be visible, which was the most satisfying kind of resolution. The Columbus Dispatch article had been shared widely enough by Friday morning that 2 other journalists had begun working on follow-up pieces, and one of them, a financial reporter named Dale Voss who specialized in real estate and property law, had noticed something in the public record that the TRO filing had made available. The emergency motion, in its haste to establish grounds for intervention, had included a supporting declaration from Merritt's investment group explaining their interest in the property. The declaration, buried in an exhibit, noted that the group had become aware of unusual ongoing utility activity at the property, specifically continued power draw to the cold storage section, suggesting possible valuable assets remaining on premises. Continued power draw to the cold storage section. Merritt had known the back freezer was still running. He had known it before Maya arrived, before Walter called her, before the auction had even transferred the property. He had known because someone had provided him with utility records for a building he didn't own, records that had been accessed without proper authorization through a contact at the utility company. He had used that information to position himself for a fast acquisition, offering a number high enough to seem generous but low enough to generate the margin he was counting on. Dale Voss published his piece on Saturday under the headline, "Developers bid to buy $328 million gold property relied on improperly obtained utility records." The Ohio Attorney General's office opened an investigation the following week. Merritt's real estate license was suspended pending the outcome. Gregory Alvarez, in the particular way of attorneys who recognized a sinking vessel, quietly withdrew from the representation. The shelf life of Merritt's offer had expired, it turned out, long before he had issued the threat. Maya read Voss's article in Earl's office on a Saturday morning with Cole eating cereal at the small table she had brought in from the retail space, and she felt no particular triumph about it. She had not needed to expose Merritt. She had not needed to file anything or accuse anyone or spend any of the energy she had been carefully preserving for the decisions that actually required it. She had just needed to stay in the building and let the documentation speak for itself, the way Earl's documentation had always been meant to speak, if anyone ever came to read it carefully enough. "Is that the developer man?" Cole asked, looking up from his cereal. "It is. Did he do something wrong? He tried to buy something by using information he wasn't supposed to have." Cole processed. "This. So he cheated. In a legal sense, yes. What happens to people who cheat? Sometimes they face consequences. In this case, it looks like they will." She set the tablet down. "But that's not our concern right now. Our concern is what we do with what we have." What they had was $328 million, for $100,000 in certified gold, a clean legal title to a commercial property on Industrial Loop Road, a 40-year ledger of meticulous acquisitions, and a formal authentication report signed by James Whitfield that would survive any scrutiny any court or institution cared to apply to it. She had been thinking about what to do with it since the night she first sat on the vault room floor. She had been thinking about Earl's instruction, "Do something good with what you find." She had been thinking about what good meant in the context of $300 million in a town of 4,000 people, in the context of a boy who needed to understand what money was for, in the context of her own life, and the 4 years of Bay 7 and the break, and the 9 days until rent. She had written it down over several evenings at Earl's desk, the list of decisions, organized in the order she would make them, because Earl had taught her through the example of his ledger that the discipline of documentation was the difference between a plan and a wish. First, Cole's future secured. A trust, structured by Walter and the estate attorney he had brought in from Columbus, that would provide for Cole's education and a stable foundation without creating the thing Earl had feared, which was the corruption of a person by money they had not yet earned the wisdom to hold. Walter had suggested specific structures for this, and Maya had approved them, and they had been filed. Second, her own stability. She had paid off her debts in full, the credit card balance, the student loan, the 3 months of back rent she still technically owed in Cleveland, the car loan on the Civic she'd been paying down for 4 years. She had paid for the brake repair and the 2 months of Mrs. Antonescu's sitting fees she had been carrying, and the field trip deposit and the next 6 field trip deposits. She had done this not with any ceremony, but with the particular quiet satisfaction of someone closing accounts that had been open too long. Third, the building. She was not selling it. She had not been certain of this until she was certain of it, which had happened the morning after the TRO was denied. Sitting in Earl's office reading his business ledger from 1974, looking at the first gold purchase in April of that year, 10 ounces from a dealer in Columbus recorded in his careful handwriting, and understanding that what she was reading was not a financial document. It was a declaration of faith. A man had started this building to do work that mattered and had done that work every day for 50 years, and had built something out of it that outlasted him. Selling that building to a strip mall developer would be the last word in a story that deserved a different last word. She was keeping it, and she was opening it again. Not as a butcher shop, or not only as a butcher shop, though she had spent several conversations with a local butcher named Frank Ostrowski, who had been working out of a smaller operation on the east end of Harlan for 12 years, and who had lit up when she mentioned the equipment in Calloway's workroom with the particular light of a craftsman encountering the right tools. Frank would run the business end. She would own the building and handle the finances and make sure the sign above the door still said what it had always said. But she was also adding something. A commercial kitchen space for rent at reasonable rates to the small food producers in the county who needed processing facilities and could not afford to build their own. She had learned, reading through economic reports on the region that Walter's associate had pulled together, that Harlan's county had more small-scale farms and food producers than it had infrastructure to support, a gap that had been holding back local food economies for a decade. The equipment Earl had maintained could be adapted. The building had the space. The cold storage capacity was substantial. She had also set aside $5 million for the Harlan Community Foundation, a fund that would be administered by a board that included Walter Griggs and Harold Fry and Sarah Bennett, the librarian, and two others she had identified through a month of conversation with the people who understood the town from the inside. The money would go toward the things small towns needed and could not fund from a diminishing tax base: school programs, road maintenance, the medical clinic that had been threatening to close for 2 years, the library's digital archive project that Sarah had been trying to get funded for longer than that. She had not announced any of this publicly. She had not held a press conference or issued a statement or spoken to Patricia Dorn, who had called 14 times. She had simply made the decisions and begun putting them into motion because Earl had not made 40 years of gold purchases by announcing them. He had made them by showing up and doing the work and documenting what he did. The announcement, when it came because Patricia Dorn was a good journalist who did not give up and who had, by December, pieced together enough of the story from public records and community sources that she had a substantially accurate account and called Walter to verify before publishing. Walter called Maya. Maya said she would speak to Patricia Dorn on the record once for 30 minutes, and that was all. The article ran on December 14th. It was thorough, accurate, and told Earl's story the way it deserved to be told, not as a treasure hunt fairy tale, but as the story of a Depression-era child who built something from nothing and kept faith with that building for 50 years and chose carefully, at the end, who would carry it forward. The response surprised Maya not in its scale, but in its nature. She had expected interest. She had expected some version of the phone calls that had already come, the investors and the journalists and the producers who wanted to option the story. Those came and were handled by Walter, who was very good at handling them. What she had not expected were the letters. They started arriving at the building's address, which was now also her address since she had sublet her Cleveland apartment and moved to Harlan with Cole in November. Because the school in Harlan had a teacher who understood that Cole was the kind of child who needed to be challenged rather than managed, and because the 2-bedroom apartment above the old hardware store 2 blocks from the butcher shop was available and had a working furnace and no dripping faucet. The letters were from people who had grown up in Harlan, people who had bought their meat from Earl Calloway for 30 years, of no one coming, through the sealed vault and the 14 months of empty darkness, all the way to now, to her, to a 7-year-old boy sitting on a stool learning the particular character of a place that had decided to keep going. Cole appeared beside her, backpack on, breath clouding in the cold. He slipped his hand into hers the way he had been doing since he was small, automatically and without ceremony. "Good first day," he said. She looked at the sign one more time, then looked at her son. "Yeah," she said. "It was." They walked together down Industrial Loop Road in the January evening, past the other buildings that were dark and the one that was orange, and the lot where nothing stood, toward the apartment 2 blocks over where the furnace was working and there was food in the refrigerator paid for without calculation, toward the life that a man who drove the same truck for 30 years and never discussed money had quietly built for them. One purchase at a time, 1 year at a time, until he ran out of time, and left the rest to the one who came. Behind them, the sign above the door of Calloway's Meats caught the last of the winter light. Established 1971. Still here. Still going. The way Earl had always intended. Diane drove down from Columbus on a Saturday in February, 3 weeks after the reopening. On a morning when the sky had cleared after 4 days of cloud, and the winter light had that particular sharpness that made everything look like it had just been cleaned. She parked in the lot beside the building and sat in her car for several minutes before coming in, which Maya observed through the retail window and did not comment on. Because some arrivals required their own preparation, and it was not anyone else's place to rush them. She came through the front door in her good wool coat, the one she wore when she wanted to feel composed, and stood in the retail space looking at the display cases and the sign above the counter, and the way the morning light came through the front windows at the same angle it had been coming through for 50 years. Her face did the thing that faces did when they were looking at something they had spent a long time trying not to see clearly and had finally stopped averting from. It was not a comfortable expression. It was the expression of someone arriving, late, at an understanding they had been circling for years. "It's smaller than I remembered," she said. Not critically, just honestly. "You were a child the last time you really paid attention to it," Maya said. Diane moved to the counter and ran her hand along its surface. The same gesture Maya had made on her first day, the gesture of a person learning a place through touch. He kept it so clean. She looked at Frank's setup behind the counter, the organized tools, the labeled hooks, everything in its place. He always kept everything so clean. I used to think it was obsessive. A pause. Now I think it was just respect. Maya poured 2 cups of coffee and brought them around the counter, and they stood together in the retail space the way women stood together in the spaces where the men they had loved had done their work, not quite comfortable and not quite uncomfortable, carrying the particular mixture of grief and recognition that came with understanding someone better after they were gone than you had managed while they were there. "Can I see it?" Diane asked. "The vault." Maya took her back through the workroom, through the cold storage corridor, past the first and second doors, around the turn to the third. She opened it with the brass key. She entered the code and worked the combination dial. The door swung open, and she turned on the light. Diane stood in the vault doorway and looked at the shelves for a long time without speaking. She looked at Earl's labels on every bar, the meticulous dating and recording, the 40 years of documented discipline visible on every surface of the room. She looked at the small shelf at the far end where the final ledger and accounting sheet still sat, because Maya had left them there as Earl had left them, because moving them would have been like erasing a signature. "He never told me," Diane said. "Not once in my entire life did he give any sign of this. He was afraid it would change things." "It would have." Diane's voice was honest and a little raw. "I'm ashamed to say it would have. Not for me, but between us. He would have become the man with the gold instead of just my father." She pressed her lips together. "He understood that better than I would have." Maya thought about Earl's letter, the line about how he kept it secret because he had seen what money did to families who knew it was coming. He had not kept it from Diane out of distrust. He had kept it from her out of love, the particular protective love of a parent who understood a child's weakness better than the child did, and who chose not to test that weakness because the relationship mattered more than the revelation. "He loved you," Maya said. "He left you the other things. The house, the savings, the truck. He gave you what he thought you could hold without it changing who you were to each other." Diane wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a brisk, unsentimental gesture that was very much her. "And he gave you this. He gave me this because he thought I could hold it without losing sight of what it was." "What is it?" Maya looked at the shelves, at the stacked bars with their labels in Earl's handwriting, at the accumulated weight of 50 years of faith in the tangible over the abstract. "It's proof that a person who starts with nothing and keeps their head down and converts every surplus into something real can build something that outlasts them." She paused. "And it's a message." He couldn't say what he needed to say out loud, so he built it instead. Diane was quiet for a while. Then she turned and walked back out of the vault room, and Maya followed and closed the door behind her, hearing the mechanism re-engage with the same solid finality it had had the first time. Standing in the freezer corridor, Diane looked at her daughter for a long moment with an expression that contained several things at once: grief and admiration, and the particular complicated love of a mother who was seeing her child clearly and finding that the view was better than expected. "Your grandmother would have understood him," Diane said. "She was the only one who always did." Cole was at school, but he had left a drawing on Earl's desk, done in colored pencil with the seriousness he brought to things that mattered to him. It was the building's facade from the street, the sign above the door, the morning light coming through the windows. He had drawn it from memory, which meant he had been looking at it carefully enough to hold it. Maya showed it to Diane and watched her mother's face do something that did not need to be named. They had lunch at the Millstone Diner, the same burgundy vinyl booth, and they talked for 2 hours in the way that mothers and daughters. And wanted to say that he had extended them credit when they couldn't pay and never mentioned it. Had set aside particular cuts for people who couldn't afford them and charged them for the lesser cut. Had shown up at 2 funerals with food and asked for nothing. People who had watched the building sit dark for 14 months and been quietly sad about it because the building meant something to them. Because a business that had been in the same place doing the same honest work for 50 years meant something to a town. The way the library and the church and the diner meant something. Not just as a service, but as evidence that permanence was possible, that something could stay. She read every letter. She kept them in a box in Earl's office, the same office where his filing cabinet still held 40 years of business records, where his chair still held the impression of decades of use. She read them and she thought about Earl, who had given her a building and a vault and a letter and a ledger, and who had not once considered whether any of it was sufficient because that was not the question he had been trying to answer. The question he had been trying to answer was simpler and harder than sufficiency. It was just this: what lasts? Cole asked her about it one evening in December, sitting at the kitchen table in the apartment above the hardware store with the snow falling outside, and his homework finished, and the particular atmosphere of a winter evening when nothing was urgently required. He asked it the way he asked things that had been circling in his mind for a while, with a directness that said he had already considered how to ask it, and this was the best version. Mom, do you think Great-Grandpa Earl was happy? She thought about this honestly, because Cole's questions deserved honest answers, and because it was the question she had been asking herself since she first read that letter in the burgundy vinyl booth at the Millstone Diner. I think he was content, she said finally. I think content and happy aren't always the same thing. He had work that mattered to him. He had a purpose he could act on every day. He built something he believed in. She paused. I think he was lonely. I think he wanted to be known more than he let himself be. I think the vault was partly what he built because he couldn't find another way to say what he needed to say. Cole was quiet for a moment, doing the thing he did with information he was working through. He knew you would come and find it. He believed I would. He was right. He was. Cole looked out the window at the snow falling on Harlan streets. I think that made him happy, he said. Not having the gold, but knowing he'd left something for someone who would know what to do with it. He turned back from the window. That's what people want, isn't it? To leave something behind that means something to someone. She looked at her son, 7 years old and sitting in a chair in a small apartment in a small Ohio town, where his great-great-grandfather had built something 50 years ago that was still standing and would now keep standing. She thought about what it meant to be the kind of person who asked this question at 7, who understood already that the gold was not the point, that the gold had never been the point, that the point was the discipline and the faith and the daily choosing to convert what you had into the thing you believed in. Yes, she said. That's exactly what people want. She opened Calloway's Meats on January 15th, which would have been Earl's 89th birthday. She had not planned the date deliberately, but when Walter mentioned it in early December while they were discussing the timeline for the renovation, she had looked at the calendar and understood that the date had chosen itself. The opening was not a ceremony. There were no balloons and no ribbon cutting and no press release, because Earl had not announced the opening of his business in 1971, and she saw no reason to behave differently now. She unlocked the front door at 7 in the morning, turned on the lights in the retail space, and Frank Ostrowski walked in from the side door carrying the first delivery of the morning in a clean white apron over his work clothes. The town came, because towns that have been paying attention know when something is open again. Harold Fry came in at 7:30 and bought a pound of ground beef and stood at the counter talking to Frank about the winter's road conditions for 15 minutes. Sarah Bennett came on her way to the library. Derek from the hardware store 2 doors down came and bought a pork roast and said it was good to see the lights on again. Patricia Dorn came at noon with a photographer, but she came as a customer, not a journalist, which Maya recognized as its own kind of courtesy, and she bought a brisket and said the case looked beautiful. Cole came after school, dropping his backpack behind the counter and sitting on the stool that had been Earl's stool for 5 decades. watching the afternoon traffic with the attentive dark eyes he had inherited from somewhere, learning the particular character of a place that had decided to keep going. At the end of the day, after Frank had cleaned the cases and locked the side door and gone home, Maya stood alone in the retail space in the quiet of closing time and looked at the sign above the counter, the same sign that had hung there since 1971. Callaway's Meats, EST 1971. She had not replaced it. She had cleaned it and straightened it and let it say what it had always said, because 50 years of honest work deserved to have its date visible. She thought about the warehouse in Cleveland, Base 7, the flickering lights. She thought about the 4 years of $12 arithmetic and the break in the 9 days. She thought about how completely the geography of her life had reorganized itself in 6 weeks, from the particular narrow channel of just enough into something that had width and depth and horizon in every direction. And she thought about a phone call at 2:14 in the morning from an unknown Ohio number, and a woman in a cold warehouse aisle who had answered it with the wary tone of someone expecting bad news, and how that woman had been right that her life was about to change and wrong about the direction of the change, and how the change had come not from luck, but from the 40-year discipline of a man who had converted every surplus dollar into something real and kept faith with the building and left the door open for the one person he believed would come and know what to do. She turned off the lights. She walked out the front door and locked it with the same commercial key she had used the first day, and she stood on the sidewalk in the January cold and looked up at the sign. Earl had built this at 31 with nothing but the conviction that the thing you built from honest work was the only thing that lasted. He had been right. It had lasted past him, through the years. Talked when they had finally agreed to stop managing each other and just be honest. They talked about Earl and about Diane's mother and about what it was like to grow up in a butcher's house in a small Ohio town and feel that it required apologizing for. They talked about what Maya's childhood had been and what she wished it had been and what she understood now that she hadn't understood then. They talked about Cole, who was Diane's grandchild in every practical sense and in the deeper sense of having inherited something from Earl that skipped the generations in between, that quality of looking at the world carefully and waiting for the real answer. Diane drove back to Columbus in the late afternoon and called from the road to say she would come again next month. Maya stood in Earl's office after the call and understood that some distances closed slowly and some closed all at once, and both kinds of closing were real. By the end of the first year, Harlan had changed in ways that were visible if you knew what to look for and invisible if you didn't, which was the best kind of change because it happened in the material of daily life rather than an announcement. The medical clinic had stayed open. The emergency had passed when the Foundation's first grant covered the operating shortfall for 2 years, while the clinic board restructured its billing operations and secured a state partnership that the shortfall had previously made them too understaffed to pursue. The doctor who had been preparing to close told the county health board that the intervention had come at the last possible moment, which was true and which Maya had not engineered intentionally, but which she understood in retrospect was the nature of last possible moments. The library's digital archive project had launched in March and by December had digitized 40 years of local newspaper records, 3 collections of private historical photographs, and the complete county agricultural records from 1910 to 1960. Sarah Bennett had sent Maya a photograph of the library's front room with every computer station occupied, which had not happened in 4 years, and the photograph had gone up on the wall of Earl's office alongside the drawing Cole had made. The shared kitchen space in the building's expanded workroom had 6 regular tenants by November. A woman named Carol who made preserves and had been selling at farmers markets for 3 years and needed certified commercial kitchen access to expand into grocery stores. 2 brothers from the county's south end who ran a small-scale charcuterie operation and had outgrown their farmhouse setup. A recent college graduate named Amara who was building a hot sauce business from a family recipe and had previously been renting time in a facility 40 minutes away, and 2 others, a pie maker and a fermentation producer, who between them represented the kind of small-scale food economy that a region like this one could support if it had the infrastructure. Maya had hired a kitchen manager to handle scheduling and compliance, a woman named Louise who had spent 20 years managing commercial kitchen operations in Columbus and had come to Harlan because her parents were aging and she had wanted to be closer, and because the job description had interested her in a way that most job descriptions did not. Louise ran the shared space with the same ordered discipline that Earl had run his workroom, which Maya recognized and appreciated every time she walked through. The population of Harlan had not dramatically increased. It was not that kind of change, the kind that showed up in census data and economic reports and was cited at development conferences as a model to be replicated. It was quieter than that, the kind of change that showed up in whether the diner was full on a Tuesday and whether the families who had been quietly planning to leave had quietly decided to stay. Harold Fry told her in October that 3 young families had bought houses in Harlan in the past year who would not have bought houses in Harlan a year ago, which was not a large number, but which was, he said, the first time that sentence had been true in a decade. It was enough. It was the right kind of enough. In March, 14 months after she first turned the brass key in the cold storage door, Maya found the last thing Earl had left for her. She found it while she was reorganizing the files in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, the drawer she had been avoiding because its contents were the personal rather than the professional, the accumulated miscellany of a private man's private keeping. She had been putting off the drawer because she was not sure she was ready for what it held, which was the particular cowardice of someone who understood that the last things were the heaviest ones. She was ready in March. The drawer held what she expected, an old address book worn smooth at the spine, a collection of birthday cards from decades past bundled with a rubber band that had lost most of its tension, a small wooden box containing Earl's cufflinks and his father's pocket watch, and a military button that she did not know the story of and would need to learn. And at the back of the drawer, in a plain white envelope with nothing written on the outside, a photograph. She almost missed the significance of it. It was a small photograph, 4x6, the kind that came from a drugstore development in an era before phones took pictures that lived in the cloud. It showed a woman she recognized from the framed photographs she had seen elsewhere in the building, Earl's wife Ruth, Cole's great-great-grandmother, who had died before Maya was old enough to know her. Ruth was standing in the retail space of the butcher shop, leaning against the counter, laughing at something off camera. The light in the photograph was summer light, warm and directional, and Ruth was younger than Maya's current age, and the laugh on her face was the unguarded kind, the laugh of someone who did not know they were being photographed or did not care. On the back of the photograph, in Earl's handwriting, a single line. She laughed like this every day. Maya sat in Earl's chair with the photograph in both hands and understood something she had been approaching for 14 months without quite reaching. She understood that the vault was not the primary thing Earl had built in this building. The vault was the document of what he had built, the evidence of it, the thing that would survive him and speak for him after he couldn't speak for himself. But the primary thing was the life he had lived here, the daily work of it. The 50 years of coming in before the sun was up and cleaning the cases and setting out the cuts and talking to the customers and coming back the next day and doing it again. The 50 years of accumulating something real, not just in the vault, but in the relationships and the trust and the particular quality of a business that operated in the same place with the same standards and the same honesty for half a century. He had built this because of Ruth, because she had laughed like that every day, and he had wanted to build something worthy of being what he stood next to while she did it. And when she was gone, he had kept building because the building was the way he knew how to honor what they had had, the way he knew how to stay connected to the life that had mattered most. The gold was not what he had made. It was just what he had saved from it. She put the photograph on the desk, propped against the filing cabinet, so she could see it while she worked. Cole found it that afternoon and stood looking at it for a while with his characteristic stillness. "Is that Ruth?" he asked. He had learned about Ruth from the stories Maya had been telling him, piecing together Earl's life from documents and photographs and letters and the accounts of people in town who had known him. "It is. She looks happy." Earl wrote on the back that she laughed like that every day. Cole looked at the photograph for another moment. Then he looked at Maya with the expression he wore when he was about to say something he had thought through carefully. "I think that's what he was really saving," he said. "Not the gold. That feeling. He was trying to save that feeling and keep it somewhere it wouldn't get lost." She looked at her son. 8 years old now, since December, taller by an inch since January, reading books that the school said were meant for older children and asking questions that were meant for older children and arriving at answers that were meant for people who had lived longer than either of them had yet managed. "I think you're right," she said. "Can we keep the photograph on the desk?" "It's staying on the desk." He nodded, satisfied, and picked up his backpack from the floor, and headed toward the door and his afternoon. The ordinary November afternoon of a boy in a small Ohio town who did his homework and read his books and watched the world with the careful dark eyes of someone who had decided early that paying attention was the most important thing you could do, because the things worth finding were always there for the people who paid enough attention to find them. She watched him go. Then she turned back to the photograph of Ruth laughing in the summer light of a butcher shop in 1971, and she thought about Earl at 31, standing behind the camera, watching his wife laugh, understanding already that this was what he was building around, that everything else was infrastructure. She thought about what it meant to be the keeper of that. She thought about Cole asking the right questions, about Diane driving back to Columbus and saying she would come again, about Harold Fry and Sarah Bennett and Frank Ostrowski and Louise and the 6 tenants in the kitchen and the 3 young families and the clinic that was still open and the library with every computer station occupied, about Walter Griggs, who still drove 14 minutes when it mattered. She thought about a woman in a cold warehouse aisle at 2 in the morning with a scanner in her hand and a broken brake on her car and 9 days until rent, answering a phone call from an unknown Ohio number because she had learned not to let things go to voicemail when something felt different about the buzzing. She thought about what Earl had known that she had not known yet when that call came, which was that she was already the person he had been waiting for. She had always been that person. She had just been waiting for the circumstances that would let her know it. The building settled around her in the late afternoon quiet, the familiar creaks of old structure, the sound of Frank finishing up in the workroom, the smell of cold and metal and decades of honest work layered into the walls. Outside the window, Harlan's industrial loop road in November, the sky going copper at its edges, the lights coming on one by one in the buildings that were occupied and staying dark in the ones that were not yet, but might be. Earl had believed in the tangible, in the thing you could hold. In the room at the back of the building that stayed cold because he had made sure it would stay cold, because he had built it carefully enough that it would be there when someone finally came who knew how to read a wall. She was still here. The building was still standing. The sign still said what it had always said. The photograph was on the desk. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was exactly what he had meant to leave behind. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.